Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we step across the threshold of time into the medieval world, not the gleaming realm of knights and fairy tales, but the earthier, more human reality that existed within the thick stone walls of feudal castles and the humble dwellings that clustered in their shadows. As you settle into comfort, perhaps pulling a soft blanket closer or adjusting your pillow just so, imagine yourself transported to an era when life moved to the rhythm of church bells and the changing seasons, when power was measured not in gold alone but in land, loyalty, and the complex dance of human relationships that bound lord to vassal, husband to wife, and sovereign to subject. The medieval period, that long stretch of centuries we call the Middle Ages, was a time when the most intimate aspects of human nature played out against a backdrop of stone fortresses, smoky hearths, and the ever-present awareness that life could be both brutally short and surprisingly tender. Tonight, we'll explore how desire, power, and the basic human need for connection shaped the daily existence of those who lived between the 9th and 15th centuries. You might wonder why we speak of such intimate matters when our purpose is to guide you toward peaceful rest. The answer lies in understanding that these were not distant, alien people, but human beings much like ourselves, individuals who loved, longed, schemed, and dreamed within the constraints of their time. Their stories, told with gentle honesty, remind us of the continuous thread of human experience that connects us across the centuries. As we begin this exploration, let your breathing slow and your mind settle. We'll move through 4 distinct windows into this world. First, immersing ourselves in the daily realities of medieval life, where personal hygiene, social customs, and the rhythms of castle and village life created the backdrop for human relationships. Then we'll follow the remarkable story of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman whose romantic and political choices reshaped the map of Europe and whose correspondence reveals the sophisticated language of medieval love. Our third passage will take us into the archaeological mysteries of medieval intimacy, the hidden carvings, curious artifacts, and cryptic records that modern scholars piece together to understand how our ancestors expressed their desires and celebrated their humanity. Finally, we'll contrast the lives of serfs and sovereigns, examining how social position shaped not just material comfort, but the very nature of love, courtship, and family life in this stratified world. Throughout our journey, we'll encounter moments of tenderness and brutality, of sophistication and crudeness, of sacred devotion and earthly passion, all woven together in the complex tapestry of medieval existence. These contrasts need not disturb your rest. Rather, let them flow over you like the distant sound of rain on a castle roof, reminding you of the full spectrum of human experience while you remain safe and comfortable in your present moment. The medieval world we're about to enter was one where the scent of rushes mixed with wood smoke in great halls, where the scratch of quills on parchment recorded both treaties and love letters, and where the stone walls that provided protection also witnessed the most private moments of their inhabitants' lives. It was a world where power and passion were inextricably linked, where marriage was diplomacy and love was revolution, where the Church's moral teachings existed alongside very human appetites and needs. So settle deeper into your comfortable space, and prepare to walk the rushes of ancient halls, to listen to the whispered conversations that echoed through castle corridors, and to understand how our medieval ancestors navigated the eternal human experiences of desire, power, and intimacy. Let the weight of centuries settle gently over you as we begin our exploration of this fascinating, complex, and ultimately very human world. Imagine yourself awakening not to the gentle hum of modern life, but to the harsh metallic percussion of hammer on anvil, the blacksmith already at work before dawn has fully broken over the castle walls. The sound echoes across the courtyard, mixing with the lowing of cattle being led to pasture and the rhythmic creak of the great wooden wheel that draws water from the well. This is how morning announced itself in the medieval world, not with alarms or gentle music, but with the immediate, unavoidable sounds of survival and labor. As you lie on your straw-filled mattress, perhaps covered by rough woolen blankets that smell faintly of the sheep they came from, the air around you carries a complex bouquet of scents that would seem overwhelming to our modern senses. The sharp tang of wood smoke drifts through the gaps in the shutters, mingling with the earthier aromas of hay, leather, and the ever-present undertone of animal waste that was simply part of medieval existence. Even in the Lord's chamber, high in the stone keep, these scents penetrated, a constant reminder that this was a world where humans and animals lived in much closer proximity than we can easily imagine today. The medieval attitude toward cleanliness and hygiene was shaped by factors we rarely consider in our current era of daily showers and running water. For the common people, bathing was an infrequent luxury, often occurring only a few times per year, typically in preparation for major religious festivals or life events. This wasn't simply a matter of laziness or ignorance, but a practical response to the enormous effort required to heat enough water for a full bath. Picture the process. Water had to be drawn from wells or rivers, carried in heavy buckets, heated over fires that consumed precious fuel, and poured into wooden tubs that might serve the entire household in succession. The very concept of hot water was a luxury that required significant resources and planning. Servants would begin the process hours before the actual bath, tending fires and heating cauldron after cauldron of water. The wooden tubs themselves were valuable household items, often shared between multiple families in a village. These vessels were typically made from oak or other hardwoods, bound with iron hoops, and required regular maintenance to prevent leaking. The water, once heated, had to be used quickly before it cooled, creating a sense of urgency around the bathing process that made it feel more like a medical procedure than a leisurely ritual. The wealthy, of course, had somewhat more options. Lords and ladies might bathe monthly or even weekly, their servants laboring to fill large wooden tubs with heated water, perhaps scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask less pleasant odors. These bathing rituals often took place in chambers warmed by braziers, the stone walls hung with tapestries to keep out drafts. The most luxurious baths might include rose petals, imported soaps made with olive oil and exotic fragrances, and soft linens warmed by the fire for drying. Yet even for the nobility, full-body bathing remained a significant undertaking, planned and prepared for like a small ceremony. Medieval soap, when available, was a harsh substance quite different from our modern varieties. Made from animal fat, typically pig or sheep tallow, combined with lye extracted from wood ash, it was effective at removing dirt and grease but could be quite hard on the skin. The process of making soap was time-consuming and required expertise, as the wrong proportions could result in a caustic mixture that burned the skin or a greasy mess that failed to clean effectively. Wealthier households might import softer soaps made with olive oil from Mediterranean regions, but these were expensive luxuries beyond the reach of most people. Between these infrequent baths, medieval people relied on other methods to maintain some semblance of cleanliness. They washed their hands and faces regularly, using basins of cold water and whatever soap was available. Clean linen undergarments, when they could afford them, were changed regularly and were believed to absorb the body's impurities, a theory that had some basis in fact, as clean clothes did help remove dead skin cells, oils, and some bacteria. The wealthy might change their linen daily, while commoners made do with weekly changes, washing their few garments in streams or communal washing areas, scrubbing them with ash water and beating them against stones to remove dirt and parasites. The washing of clothes was itself a significant undertaking that reveals much about medieval attitudes toward cleanliness and social relationships. Laundry day was typically a communal affair, with women gathering at streams, ponds, or communal washing areas to scrub their families' garments. The process involved soaking clothes in cold water, applying harsh lye soap, scrubbing with brushes or beating with wooden paddles, and then rinsing multiple times to remove the soap residue. The work was physically demanding and time-consuming, often taking an entire day for a household's weekly wash. These washing gatherings served important social functions beyond simple cleanliness. Women would share news, gossip, and advice while working together. Young unmarried women could meet potential suitors who might happen by, though always under the watchful eyes of older women. The quality of a woman's laundry skills was considered an important indicator of her suitability as a wife, and mothers would carefully teach their daughters the proper techniques for removing different types of stains and preserving fabric. Hair care presented its own challenges and conventions that reveal much about medieval society and its relationship with the body. Long hair was fashionable for both men and women of the upper classes, but it also provided excellent habitat for lice and fleas, tiny parasites that were simply an accepted part of medieval life. These insects were so common that they became part of the social fabric, with specialized combs designed for their removal and social rituals built around delousing. Medieval people developed various strategies for dealing with these unwelcome guests. Fine-toothed ivory combs for the wealthy, made from walrus tusks or elephant ivory and often beautifully carved with decorative motifs. These combs were valuable possessions, passed down through generations and sometimes included in wills alongside other precious items. For the common people, wooden or bone combs served the same purpose, though they were often cruder in construction and less effective at capturing small parasites. Careful grooming sessions where family members would check each other's hair for parasites became intimate bonding rituals, particularly between mothers and daughters or between married couples. These sessions might last for hours, with the groomer carefully parting sections of hair and removing insects by hand or with specialized tools. The process required patience, trust, and physical closeness that created opportunities for conversation and emotional connection. Various oils and herbs were believed to repel insects, leading to the development of elaborate hair treatments that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Wealthy women might have their hair washed with special preparations containing herbs like wormwood, rue, or pennyroyal, which were thought to discourage lice and fleas. These treatments often left the hair with a distinctive herbal scent that became associated with cleanliness and high social status. The practice of wearing head coverings served multiple purposes that extended far beyond simple fashion. For women, head coverings displayed marital status. Unmarried girls might wear their hair uncovered or with simple bands, while married women were expected to cover their hair completely as a sign of modesty and respectability. These coverings also kept hair relatively clean by protecting it from dust, smoke, and environmental contaminants, and provided some protection from vermin. Men's head coverings, including various styles of caps, hoods, and hats, served similar practical purposes while also indicating social status, occupation, and regional identity. A merchant might wear a distinctive cap that identified his trade, while a nobleman's hat would display his wealth through expensive materials and elaborate decoration. Peasants wore simple woolen caps or hoods that provided warmth and protection while working outdoors. The question of personal hygiene becomes even more complex when we consider the intimate aspects of medieval life and how the realities of daily existence shaped romantic and sexual relationships. Privacy, as we understand it, was largely a luxury of the very wealthy. Most people lived in single-room dwellings where entire families slept together, often sharing beds not only with each other but with livestock during cold winter months when the animals' body heat helped warm the living space. These crowded living conditions meant that children grew up with a very different understanding of privacy and bodily functions than we have today. They witnessed their parents' intimate moments, learned about sexuality through direct observation rather than formal education, and developed attitudes toward the body that were more accepting of its natural functions and less concerned with individual privacy. This wasn't necessarily traumatic or problematic within the context of medieval society, where such arrangements were normal and expected. The concept of personal space was fluid and practical rather than rooted in notions of individual privacy or psychological boundaries. Beds were valuable pieces of furniture that might accommodate multiple people by necessity rather than choice. Even wealthy households often had fewer beds than inhabitants, leading to various sleeping arrangements that prioritized warmth, safety, and efficient use of space over individual privacy. In these crowded conditions, the management of bodily functions required creative solutions that tell us much about medieval attitudes toward the body and its needs. Chamber pots were common among those who could afford them. Simple ceramic or wooden vessels that were emptied into communal waste areas or, in castles, into the moat or surrounding grounds. These pots were often kept under beds or in small alcoves, and their use was accepted as a natural part of daily life rather than something shameful or hidden. The emptying of these pots was typically assigned to the lowest servants, often young girls or elderly women who had few other options for employment. The contents might be saved for use in gardens, as human waste was recognized as valuable fertilizer, or they might be disposed of in designated areas outside the living spaces. In castles and larger households, there might be specific servants whose primary job was managing waste disposal, a necessary but low-status occupation that nonetheless required some skill and knowledge. Public latrines, when they existed, were communal affairs that reflected medieval attitudes toward bodily functions and social hierarchy. Castle garderobes, literally cloth guards, named for their supposed ability to protect stored clothing from insects, were built into the castle walls, with waste falling directly into the moat or a pit below. These facilities offered little privacy, often accommodating multiple users simultaneously, with simple wooden seats arranged over openings in the floor. The design of these garderobes reveals much about medieval engineering and social attitudes. They were typically located in towers or along outer walls where waste could fall away from the main living areas. Some were equipped with chutes or channels that directed waste toward moats or rivers, while others emptied into deep pits that had to be cleaned periodically by unfortunate servants. The most sophisticated designs included multiple levels of garderobes sharing the same chute, allowing waste from upper floors to flush away waste from lower levels. The wealthy might have private garderobes attached to their chambers, but even these were hardly the sanitary private facilities we expect today. They were cold, drafty spaces that provided minimal comfort and no real privacy from sounds or smells. The proximity to living spaces meant that these facilities had to be regularly cleaned and maintained to prevent offensive odors from overwhelming the inhabitants. For common people, communal latrines or designated outdoor areas served the same function. Villages might have shared facilities built over streams or pits, while individual households might simply use designated areas behind their dwellings. The management of human waste was a constant concern that required community cooperation and established customs to prevent the spread of disease and maintain basic sanitation. The intimate lives of medieval people unfolded against this backdrop of limited privacy and challenging hygiene. Courtship and romance had to be conducted within the constraints of social surveillance and practical limitations that would seem overwhelming to modern couples. For the common people, romantic relationships often developed within the tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, making secret courtships nearly impossible and creating intense social pressure around appropriate behavior. Young people might steal moments of privacy during festivals, while working in fields, or during the brief summer evenings when extended daylight allowed for evening gatherings. These stolen moments were precious and had to be carefully managed to avoid social disapproval or accusations of impropriety. A young couple might find opportunities to speak privately while gathering herbs, tending animals, or during communal work projects where they could work near each other while maintaining the appearance of propriety. The seasonal nature of agricultural work created natural opportunities for courtship and social interaction. Spring planting brought communities together for cooperative work projects, while summer festivals provided more relaxed social atmospheres where young people could interact under less formal circumstances. Harvest time was particularly important for romantic relationships, as the successful completion of the harvest created a celebratory mood and provided resources for weddings and other celebrations. Among the nobility, the dance of courtship was more elaborate but no less constrained by social expectations and political considerations. The concept of courtly love, the idealized, often unrequited passion celebrated in medieval literature, existed alongside much more practical considerations of marriage alliances, property transfer, and political advantage. A noble lady might receive passionate verses from a troubadour while knowing that her actual marriage would be arranged to strengthen her family's position and had little to do with her personal preferences or romantic feelings. These courtly relationships often took place within the complex social environment of medieval courts, where dozens or even hundreds of people lived in close proximity, and where every interaction was observed and interpreted for its political significance. A glance, a shared smile, or a brief conversation might be analyzed for signs of romantic interest or political alliance, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance that made genuine privacy nearly impossible. The physical expression of these relationships was influenced by the era's understanding of human sexuality, which blended classical medical knowledge with Christian moral teaching and folk wisdom passed down through generations. Medieval physicians, drawing on ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the works of Galen and other classical authorities, believed that sexual activity was necessary for health, especially for men, whose bodies were thought to require regular release of sexual fluids to maintain proper balance. These medical theories taught that sexual abstinence could lead to various physical and mental ailments, including melancholy, madness, and physical weakness. However, they also warned that excessive indulgence could lead to spiritual weakness, physical exhaustion, and moral corruption. This created a delicate balance that individuals had to navigate, often with guidance from physicians, confessors, and family members who helped determine what constituted appropriate sexual behavior. The Church taught that sexual pleasure within marriage was acceptable and even necessary for procreation, but it also promoted the ideal of celibacy and warned against the spiritual dangers of lustful desires. This created a complex theological framework that acknowledged human sexual needs while maintaining that the highest spiritual calling involved transcending those needs through celibacy and devotion to God. These competing influences created a complex landscape for intimate relationships that varied significantly depending on social class, regional customs, and individual circumstances. Marriage was considered the appropriate venue for sexual expression, but the realities of medieval marriage were often quite different from our modern romantic ideals, being shaped more by economic necessity and social obligation than by emotional attachment or physical attraction. Marriages, especially among the nobility, were typically arranged for political or economic advantage, often when the participants were still children. These arrangements might be made when the future spouses were infants, creating complex situations where families had to maintain relationships and negotiate terms over many years before the marriage was actually consummated. The actual consummation might be delayed until the bride reached puberty, but the legal and social bonds were established much earlier, creating a form of relationship that modern people would find difficult to understand. Within marriage, the expectations and experiences of intimacy varied greatly depending on social class, regional customs, and individual circumstances. The Church provided detailed guidance on appropriate sexual behavior within marriage, including prescribed positions, acceptable frequency, and periods of abstinence during religious seasons like Lent and Advent. However, the private reality of married couples likely varied considerably from these official prescriptions, as human nature and individual needs often conflicted with institutional requirements. The question of consent within medieval marriage is complex and troubling by modern standards, revealing fundamental differences between medieval and contemporary understanding of individual rights and autonomy. Women, regardless of social class, had limited legal rights and were expected to submit to their husband's authority in all matters, including intimate ones. The concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval law or social understanding, as a wife's body was considered to belong to her husband just as her property and legal identity became his upon marriage. This brings us to one of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of medieval sexual customs, the legendary droit du seigneur, or jus primi noctis, the supposed right of feudal lords to sleep with peasant brides on their wedding night. This concept has captured the imagination of modern audiences, appearing in films, novels, and popular histories as an example of medieval brutality and exploitation, often serving as a shorthand for the supposed barbarism and injustice of feudal society. However, historical evidence for the actual practice of this custom is surprisingly limited and controversial among serious medieval historians. The idea of the lord's sexual privilege over his vassals' wives appears in various forms throughout medieval literature and law codes, but distinguishing between legal reality, literary fantasy, propaganda, and later historical invention becomes increasingly difficult as we examine the evidence more closely and apply rigorous historical methodology. Some medieval legal documents do contain references to payments that grooms could make to their lords to avoid certain obligations on their wedding night, but these may have been symbolic taxes, fees for permission to marry, or payments to avoid other forms of service rather than literal sexual privileges. The interpretation of these documents is complicated by the fact that medieval legal language was often formulaic and symbolic rather than literal, making it difficult to determine what actual practices they describe. The earliest clear references to such customs appear in medieval literary works rather than legal documents, suggesting that the concept may have been more of a literary device, satirical exaggeration, or political accusation than a widespread social reality. Medieval writers often used allegations of sexual impropriety to criticize their political enemies or to illustrate the corruption of powerful figures, much as modern political discourse uses sexual scandals to discredit opponents. The accusation that a lord claimed sexual privileges over his subjects' wives was a particularly effective way to portray him as tyrannical and immoral, combining religious condemnation of adultery with political criticism of abuse of power. This made such accusations valuable tools in political conflicts, regardless of their factual accuracy, and helps explain why references to these practices appear more often in hostile chronicles and satirical literature than in neutral legal documents. When we do find historical evidence of lords demanding sexual access to peasant women, it often appears in the context of specific abuses by individual rulers rather than as an accepted feudal custom with legal sanction and social approval. The distinction is important. While powerful men throughout history have used their positions to coerce sexual favors, this is different from a legally sanctioned system that gave lords automatic sexual rights over their vassals' wives as part of the feudal contract. As the morning sounds of the medieval world gradually fade around you, the blacksmith's hammer falling silent, the cattle settled in their pastures, the great wheel at the well finally still, we prepare to leave this exploration of daily life and move toward the grand political and romantic drama that shaped the medieval world at its highest levels. Let the complexity of medieval life settle gently in your mind, like dust motes floating in the slanted light of a medieval window, as we prepare to encounter one of the most remarkable figures of the age. As we turn our attention from the everyday realities of medieval life to the grand stage of European politics, imagine yourself standing in the great hall of a 12th century palace, where tapestries woven with threads of gold catch the flickering light of hundreds of candles. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive imported incense, and the subtle perfumes that mark the presence of the most powerful people in Christendom. Here, in chambers lined with silk hangings from Constantinople and carpets from distant Islamic lands, the personal desires of a single remarkable woman would reshape the political landscape of Europe and influence the course of history for generations to come. Eleanor of Aquitaine was born sometime around 1122 into a world where women, even those of the highest nobility, were expected to serve as pawns in the great game of dynastic politics. Yet she would transform herself into perhaps the most powerful woman of the medieval period, a figure whose romantic choices and political maneuvering would create and destroy kingdoms, launch crusades, and establish cultural traditions that would influence European civilization for centuries. Her story begins in the sun-drenched courts of southern France, in the Duchy of Aquitaine, a realm that stretched from the Loire River to the Pyrenees and encompassed much of what we now know as southwestern France. This was a land of troubadours and olive groves, of sophisticated courts where poetry and music flourished alongside political intrigue. The culture of Aquitaine was markedly different from the more austere traditions of northern France, more influenced by the refinements of Islamic Spain, more tolerant of luxury and sensual pleasure, more willing to grant women positions of influence and respect. Eleanor's grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, had been one of the earliest troubadours, a poet-duke who scandalized the church with his verses celebrating earthly love, and who set a precedent for the sophisticated, pleasure-loving culture that would characterize the Aquitanian court. His poems, which survive in fragments, reveal a man who celebrated physical pleasure with an openness that shocked his contemporaries. One of his most famous verses speaks of women as the sweetest thing in the world, and describes intimate encounters with a frankness that would make even modern readers blush. When Eleanor inherited the duchy at the age of 15, she became not just one of the wealthiest individuals in Europe, but also the inheritor of a cultural tradition that celebrated refined love, artistic expression, and the complex interplay between desire and power. The court she inherited was already famous throughout Europe for its sophistication, attracting scholars from the emerging universities of Paris and Bologna, artists from the Byzantine Empire, and merchants who brought exotic goods from as far away as India and China. The inheritance that fell to Eleanor was staggering in its scope and wealth. The Duchy of Aquitaine was larger and richer than the domains controlled by the King of France himself, producing vast quantities of wine, salt, and other valuable commodities that funded a court of unprecedented luxury and sophistication. The revenues from her lands could support thousands of knights, fund the construction of magnificent cathedrals, and patronize artists and scholars whose work would influence European culture for centuries. The young Duchess found herself in control of revenues that could finance armies, build cathedrals, and patronize artists and scholars from across Europe. Her court at Poitiers became a beacon of learning and refinement, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated with breathtaking artistry, where musicians from different traditions shared their knowledge and created new forms of artistic expression, and where young nobles from across Europe came to learn the sophisticated arts of governance and courtly behavior. But with this wealth came vulnerability. A young, unmarried woman controlling such vast territories was an irresistible target for ambitious nobles and scheming kings. Within months of her inheritance, Eleanor found herself at the center of a whirlwind of marriage negotiations that would determine not only her personal fate, but the balance of power across medieval Europe. The political situation surrounding Eleanor's inheritance was incredibly complex, involving not only French internal politics but also the broader struggle between Christianity and Islam in Spain, the complex relationships between the various German princes and the Holy Roman Emperor, and the ongoing tensions between secular and ecclesiastical authority that characterized the medieval period. Every major power in Europe had an interest in controlling the young Duchess and her territories. The marriage that was arranged for her, to Louis VII of France, seemed like a perfect solution to the political challenges facing both realms. Louis needed the wealth and strategic territories of Aquitaine to strengthen France against its rivals, while Eleanor needed the protection that marriage to the French king could provide. The wedding, celebrated in 1137 in the Cathedral of Bordeaux, was a spectacular affair that announced to all of Europe that a new power had emerged through the union of French royal authority with Aquitanian wealth. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of medieval pageantry, designed to demonstrate the wealth and power of the new alliance. Eleanor appeared in robes of silk and cloth of gold, her hair adorned with a crown that included jewels from her family's treasury that had been collected over generations. The cathedral was decorated with tapestries and banners that told the history of both dynasties, while musicians and poets performed works specially commissioned for the occasion. Yet from the beginning, the marriage was marked by fundamental incompatibilities that would eventually tear it apart and reshape the medieval world. Louis VII was a pious, ascetic man who had been destined for the church before the unexpected death of his elder brother made him heir to the throne. He approached kingship with the mindset of a monk, seeing worldly pleasures as temptations to be resisted and viewing his wife's sophisticated, pleasure-loving court with suspicion and disapproval. Louis's daily routine reflected his monastic inclinations. He rose before dawn for private prayers, attended multiple religious services throughout the day, and spent his evenings in study or religious contemplation. He wore simple clothing even on formal occasions, ate plain food, and surrounded himself with advisors who shared his ascetic worldview. The contrast with Eleanor's expectations could hardly have been more stark. Eleanor, by contrast, had been raised in a culture that celebrated refinement, artistic achievement, and the complex rituals of courtly love. She was accustomed to being surrounded by troubadours, poets, and scholars who competed for her attention with elaborate verses and sophisticated conversation. The stark, military atmosphere of the French court, with its emphasis on duty and religious observance, must have felt like a prison to a woman who had grown up expecting to be celebrated and courted. The contrast between the two courts reveals much about the cultural diversity of medieval Europe and the challenges facing any attempt to unite different regional traditions under a single rule. The French court, centered in Paris and the Ile-de-France, reflected the austere piety and military focus that characterized Northern European Christianity. Luxury was viewed with suspicion, artistic expression was subordinated to religious purposes, and women were expected to remain in the background of political life. The Aquitanian tradition, by contrast, had been shaped by contact with Islamic Spain, Byzantine luxury, and the sophisticated urban culture of the Mediterranean world. Here, troubadours composed elaborate songs celebrating the beauty and wisdom of noble ladies, courts competed to attract the most skilled artists and musicians, and women were expected to play active roles in cultural and political life. The physical intimacy between Eleanor and Louis seems to have been as problematic as their cultural differences. Medieval chroniclers, writing with the discretion required when discussing royal marriages, nonetheless hint at fundamental incompatibilities that went beyond mere personality conflicts. Louis's monkish inclinations apparently extended to his marital relations, while Eleanor's passionate nature found little satisfaction in a husband who viewed physical pleasure with suspicion and guilt. Contemporary accounts suggest that Louis approached his marital duties with the same grim determination he brought to other aspects of kingship, viewing physical intimacy as a necessary but distasteful obligation rather than a source of pleasure or emotional connection. Eleanor, raised in a culture that celebrated sensual pleasure and emotional sophistication, must have found this approach deeply unsatisfying and personally insulting. The couple's inability to produce a male heir became a source of increasing tension as the years passed. In a world where royal marriages were judged primarily by their success in continuing dynastic lines, the birth of 2 daughters but no sons was seen as a sign of divine displeasure or fundamental incompatibility. The pressure to produce a male heir created additional strain on a relationship that was already troubled by cultural and personal differences. Medieval medical understanding of conception, based largely on classical theories inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, suggested that successful pregnancy required the active participation and satisfaction of both partners. This created additional pressure on Eleanor and Louis, as their obvious marital difficulties were seen not only as personal problems but as obstacles to the continuation of the Capetian dynasty. The breaking point came during the Second Crusade, when Eleanor accompanied Louis to the Holy Land in what was supposed to be a demonstration of royal piety and unity. Instead, the crusade became the stage for a scandal that would reverberate throughout medieval Europe and provide the justification for the eventual annulment of their marriage. Eleanor's decision to accompany Louis on crusade was itself controversial, as few women of her rank had previously undertaken such journeys. She brought with her a large retinue of Aquitanian nobles, including many women, transforming what was supposed to be a military expedition into something resembling a royal progress. Her presence changed the entire character of the crusade, introducing elements of courtly culture and sophisticated social interaction that many of the more austere crusaders found inappropriate. The scandal centered on Eleanor's relationship with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, who had become Prince of Antioch and was one of the most powerful crusader lords in the East. Raymond was a charismatic figure who embodied many of the qualities that Eleanor found lacking in her husband. He was cultured, sophisticated, politically astute, and comfortable with the kind of luxury and refinement that Eleanor had known in Aquitaine. Raymond's court in Antioch was famous throughout the Crusader states for its sophistication and luxury. He had married Constance of Antioch, a beautiful and intelligent woman who shared Eleanor's interest in poetry and courtly culture. Together, they had created a court that rivaled anything in Europe for its artistic achievements and intellectual sophistication. When the crusading army reached Antioch, Eleanor was reunited with her uncle in circumstances that quickly became the subject of intense speculation and gossip. The two spent long hours in private conversation, discussing strategy for the crusade and the political situation in the East. Eleanor supported Raymond's plans for the crusading army, which differed significantly from Louis's intentions, creating a public disagreement between the royal couple that scandalized observers and provided ammunition for their enemies. The exact nature of Eleanor's relationship with Raymond remains one of the great mysteries of medieval history. Contemporary chroniclers, writing decades after the events and often with clear political motivations, provide conflicting accounts that range from hints of inappropriate intimacy to suggestions of outright adultery. Some sources suggest that Eleanor and Raymond were lovers, while others maintain that their relationship was purely political and that the scandal was manufactured by enemies seeking to discredit Eleanor. Modern historians have debated whether the scandal was based on genuine impropriety or was manufactured by enemies seeking to discredit Eleanor and provide grounds for annulling her marriage to Louis. The evidence is frustratingly incomplete, consisting mainly of hostile chronicles written years after the events by authors with clear political motivations. What seems clear is that Eleanor's behavior in Antioch, provided her husband's advisors with the ammunition they needed to begin discussing the possibility of ending a marriage that had already proven politically and personally unsatisfactory. The accusation of adultery, whether true or false, gave Louis the religious and legal justification he needed to seek an annulment while allowing him to retain some measure of dignity and political advantage. The journey back to Europe was marked by increasing hostility between the royal couple, with Eleanor reportedly demanding an immediate annulment and Louis refusing to consider releasing such a valuable prize. The tension between them became so severe that they traveled separately for much of the journey, each surrounded by their own supporters and advisors who began preparing for the political crisis that would inevitably follow their return. During this difficult period, Eleanor began corresponding secretly with various political figures across Europe, laying the groundwork for her eventual escape from a marriage that had become intolerable. Her letters from this period, written in coded language to avoid interception by Louis's agents, reveal a woman of remarkable political intelligence who was already planning her next moves while maintaining the appearance of royal propriety. The annulment proceedings, when they finally began in 1152, were conducted with the delicate political maneuvering that characterized all major medieval diplomatic initiatives. The official grounds were consanguinity, the discovery that Louis and Eleanor were related within the prohibited degrees established by church law. This was a convenient fiction that allowed both parties to save face while dissolving a marriage that had become politically impossible to maintain. The real negotiations, however, centered on the disposition of Eleanor's territories and the question of her future marriage. Louis was forced to return all of Aquitaine to Eleanor, a decision that would prove to be one of the most costly mistakes in French royal history. In exchange, he retained custody of their 2 daughters, ensuring that any future male heirs Eleanor might produce would not have claims on French territories. The speed with which Eleanor moved to secure her independence and arrange a new marriage reveals much about her political acumen and personal determination. Within weeks of the annulment, she had entered into secret negotiations with Henry Plantagenet, the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who would soon become King Henry II of England. The courtship between Eleanor and Henry, conducted largely through intermediaries and coded correspondence, was one of the most remarkable romantic and political alliances of the medieval period. Henry, despite being 11 years younger than Eleanor, recognized both her political value and her personal attractions. His letters to her during this period, written in a mixture of Latin and the vernacular languages they both spoke, reveal a man of considerable intelligence and charm who understood how to appeal to Eleanor's sophisticated tastes. Eleanor's responses, equally sophisticated and politically astute, show her carefully evaluating Henry's potential as both a husband and a political partner. She was clearly attracted to his energy and ambition, but she was also acutely aware of the political implications of any new marriage and determined not to repeat the mistakes of her first union. The marriage between Eleanor and Henry, celebrated in May 1152 with almost indecent haste after her annulment from Louis, created a political earthquake that transformed the balance of power in medieval Europe. The union brought together the vast territories of Aquitaine with Henry's holdings in Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, creating an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees and controlled more territory than the King of France. But beyond its political significance, the marriage between Eleanor and Henry represented a fascinating study in medieval power dynamics and the complex interplay between personal desire and political calculation. Henry was 11 years younger than Eleanor, an energetic and charismatic ruler whose ambitions matched her own. Unlike her first marriage, this union seems to have been based on genuine mutual attraction and respect, as well as shared political goals. The wedding ceremony itself was a deliberate contrast to Eleanor's first marriage, emphasizing the personal choice and mutual affection of the couple rather than the political necessities that had dominated her union with Louis. The couple exchanged personally written vows that included promises of emotional as well as political partnership, and the celebration included performances by troubadours who sang of love freely chosen rather than politically arranged. The early years of their marriage were marked by remarkable success and apparent happiness. Eleanor provided Henry with the wealth and territories he needed to pursue his claim to the English throne, while he offered her the political partnership and intellectual stimulation that had been lacking in her marriage to Louis. Together, they created a court culture that became the envy of medieval Europe, attracting scholars, artists, and political figures from across the continent. The couple's physical relationship appears to have been passionate and fulfilling, producing 8 children in the first 15 years of their marriage. Medieval chroniclers, always circumspect when discussing royal intimacy, nonetheless hint at a relationship marked by intense mutual attraction and genuine affection. Eleanor's pregnancy with her first child by Henry, occurring within months of their marriage, was seen as a sign of divine approval and political legitimacy. The court culture that Eleanor established as Queen of England represented a remarkable synthesis of different European traditions and her own personal vision of how power and culture should intersect. Drawing on the troubadour traditions of Aquitaine, the scholarly culture of Paris, and the administrative efficiency of Norman England, she created an environment that was both intellectually sophisticated and politically effective. Her court at various English castles, Winchester, Westminster, and especially the palace at Woodstock, became centers of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. She established scriptoriums where manuscripts were copied and illuminated, workshops where artists created magnificent objects in gold and precious stones, and libraries that contained works from across the known world. The troubadours who gathered around Eleanor's court were not merely entertainers but sophisticated artists whose work helped to define new ideals of love, honor, and social behavior. These poet-musicians composed elaborate works that celebrated not only romantic love, but also the complex relationships between lords and vassals, rulers and subjects, men and women that characterized medieval society. Eleanor's correspondence with these troubadours reveals a woman of remarkable intellectual sophistication and emotional complexity. The letters and poems that survive from this period show her engaging with some of the most advanced thinking of her time about the nature of love, the proper relationship between the sexes, and the role of emotion in political life. Among the most significant of these relationships was her correspondence with Aquitaine de Troyes, the great romance writer who would later create some of the most influential Arthurian literature. Eleanor's letters to Aquitaine reveal her active involvement in shaping the literary works that emerged from her court, suggesting plots, discussing character development, and providing the cultural framework within which these stories would be understood. The concept of courtly love that developed around Eleanor's court represented a revolutionary approach to the relationship between men and women in medieval society. This literary and cultural movement portrayed women as objects of veneration and service rather than mere property to be controlled by male relatives. Men were expected to prove their worth through elaborate demonstrations of devotion, skill, and moral virtue, while women were granted the power to judge and reward male behavior. The coded language of courtly love served multiple purposes in Eleanor's court and others like it across medieval Europe. On one level, it provided a sophisticated form of entertainment that demonstrated the cultural refinement of noble society. On another level, it offered a way to discuss political relationships and social hierarchies through metaphors of romantic devotion. Most significantly, it created a cultural space where women could exercise forms of power and influence that were otherwise denied to them by medieval law and custom. Eleanor's personal involvement in these cultural developments went far beyond mere patronage. She actively participated in the composition and performance of troubadour works, contributing her own verses to the growing body of courtly literature. Her letters to various troubadours show her engaging with complex questions about the nature of love and honor, often using elaborate metaphors and coded references that required sophisticated cultural knowledge to interpret. The relationship between Bernard de Ventadour, one of the most celebrated troubadours of the period, and Eleanor provides a particularly fascinating example of how these cultural and personal relationships operated. Bernard's poems to Eleanor are masterpieces of the troubadour tradition, combining passionate declarations of love with subtle political commentary and sophisticated artistic technique. Bernard de Ventadour was born into the lower nobility of the Limousin region, but his extraordinary talent as a poet and musician elevated him to positions of influence in some of the most sophisticated courts of his time. His relationship with Eleanor began during her first marriage, when he served briefly at the French court, but it developed its full intensity only after her marriage to Henry II. The question of whether these relationships involved physical intimacy remains one of the most debated aspects of Eleanor's biography. The conventional interpretation of courtly love emphasized spiritual rather than physical connection, but the intensity of some surviving correspondence suggests that the boundaries between different types of relationships were more fluid than official ideology acknowledged. Bernard's famous poem, "When I See the Skylark Move Its Wings with Joy Against the Light," is often interpreted as a lament for his separation from Eleanor, composed after Henry II became suspicious of their relationship and banished the troubadour from court. The poem's elaborate metaphors and emotional intensity suggest a relationship that went beyond formal courtly convention, though the exact nature of their connection remains mysterious. The poem itself is a masterpiece of medieval literature, using the image of a skylark's ecstatic flight toward the sun as a metaphor for the poet's spiritual and emotional elevation through love. But beneath this conventional imagery lies a current of genuine grief and loss that suggests personal experience rather than mere literary convention. Eleanor's relationship with other troubadours, including Raimbot d'Orange and Giraud de Bornal, followed similar patterns of intense artistic collaboration combined with personal intimacy that defied easy categorization. These relationships allowed Eleanor to exercise forms of cultural and emotional power that were otherwise unavailable to medieval women, while also providing her with intellectual stimulation and artistic satisfaction that were missing from her official political roles. Raimbot d'Orange, in particular, seems to have served as both artistic collaborator and political advisor, his poems often containing coded references to current political situations and advice about how Eleanor should handle various challenges to her authority. His verses reveal a relationship based on intellectual equality and mutual respect that was rare in medieval society. The growing tension between Eleanor and Henry, which would eventually lead to open rebellion and civil war, had its roots partly in their different approaches to these cultural relationships. Henry, despite his own sophistication and intelligence, viewed Eleanor's troubadour court with increasing suspicion as a potential threat to royal authority and marital fidelity. The specific incident that triggered their final break remains unclear, but it seems to have involved Henry's discovery of correspondence between Eleanor and one or more of her troubadour friends that he interpreted as evidence of adultery or political conspiracy. Medieval chroniclers provide conflicting accounts of what exactly transpired, but the result was a complete breakdown in trust between the royal couple. Henry's relationship with Rosamund Clifford, his young mistress whom he installed at Woodstock Palace, provided Eleanor with her own grounds for grievance and may have been intended partly as retaliation for her troubadour relationships. The famous story of Eleanor discovering Rosamund in a maze at Woodstock and forcing her to choose between poison and a dagger is almost certainly legendary, but it reflects the intense personal animosity that had developed between the royal couple. The transformation of Eleanor from beloved queen to political prisoner represents one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in medieval history. The woman who had once been celebrated as the most powerful and sophisticated ruler in Europe found herself confined to various castles and forced to watch as her sons rebelled against their father with her encouragement and support. Eleanor's imprisonment, which lasted for nearly 16 years, was conducted with the elaborate courtesy that medieval politics required, but was nonetheless genuine and restrictive. She was moved between various royal castles, always under guard, always prevented from communicating freely with the outside world, always aware that her continued existence depended on Henry's political calculations rather than any affection or respect he might still feel for her. During these long years of captivity, Eleanor developed an extensive network of secret correspondents who kept her informed of political developments and carried her messages to allies across Europe. These letters, many of which have survived in various archives, reveal a woman of extraordinary resilience and political acumen who refused to accept defeat even in the most desperate circumstances. Eleanor's role in orchestrating the rebellion of her sons against Henry II reveals both her political skill and her personal desperation. Cut off from direct political power and separated from the cultural life that had given her such satisfaction, she used her influence over her children to strike back at the husband who had betrayed and imprisoned her. The letters she managed to smuggle to her sons during her captivity show a woman of remarkable political acumen and personal determination. Using elaborate codes and trusted messengers, she coordinated a rebellion that would eventually involve most of the major powers of medieval Europe and threaten to destroy the Angevin Empire that she and Henry had built together. Her correspondence with young Henry, her eldest son, reveals the complex mixture of maternal affection and political calculation that characterized her relationships with her children. She encouraged his rebellion not only as revenge against his father, but also as a way of securing a political future for herself and ensuring that the cultural values she had championed would survive Henry II's increasingly authoritarian rule. The rebellion that erupted in 1173 was fought not only on battlefields but also in the realm of public opinion and cultural influence. Eleanor used her extensive network of troubadour friends and cultural allies to spread propaganda supporting her son's cause, turning the sophisticated cultural apparatus she had created into a weapon against her husband. The poems and songs that emerged from this period reveal the extent to which personal relationships and political conflicts had become intertwined in Eleanor's world. Troubadours who had once celebrated her beauty and wisdom now composed works lamenting her imprisonment and calling for her liberation. These works served not only as artistic expressions, but also as political documents that helped to legitimize her son's rebellion and maintain support for their cause. Bertrand de Born, the warrior poet who became one of the most vocal supporters of the rebellion, composed verses that portrayed Eleanor as a wrongly imprisoned queen whose sufferings symbolized the oppression of all who valued freedom and justice. His poems helped to transform what might have been seen as a family quarrel into a broader conflict between tyranny and liberty. The eventual failure of the rebellion and Eleanor's continued imprisonment marked the end of one phase of her remarkable career, but not the end of her influence on medieval culture and politics. Even in captivity, she continued to correspond with scholars, artists, and political figures across Europe, maintaining the intellectual and cultural networks that had made her court so influential. The letters from this period reveal a woman who had learned to exercise power through influence rather than direct authority, using her reputation and connections to shape events even when she was physically constrained. Her correspondence with various church officials, for example, helped to maintain pressure on Henry to treat her with appropriate dignity and respect, while her letters to political allies kept alive the possibility of future changes in her circumstances. Eleanor's eventual release and return to political prominence after Henry's death, in 1189 demonstrated the enduring power of the networks she had built and maintained throughout her career. At an age when most medieval women would have been considered finished with public life, she emerged from captivity to serve as regent for Richard I and to play crucial roles in the politics of the Third Crusade and the succession crisis that followed Richard's death. Her regency, though brief, was marked by the same combination of political skill and cultural sophistication that had characterized her earlier career. She used her authority to pardon political prisoners, restore confiscated properties, and re-establish the cultural institutions that had been suppressed during her imprisonment. The cultural influence of Eleanor's court continued to shape European civilization long after her own death in 1204. The ideals of courtly love that had developed around her circle influenced literature, art, and social behavior for centuries, while the model of female cultural patronage she had established inspired countless imitators across medieval Europe. Her correspondence, much of which has survived in various archives across Europe, provides us with one of the most intimate and detailed portraits we have of medieval royal life and the complex relationships between personal desire and political power that characterized the highest levels of medieval society. These letters reveal a woman of remarkable intelligence, passion, and determination who refused to accept the limitations that medieval society tried to place on female ambition and achievement. As we consider Eleanor's extraordinary life and its impact on medieval Europe, we can see how individual desires and relationships could reshape the political landscape of entire continents. Her story reminds us that behind the grand movements of medieval history were real people whose loves, hatreds, and ambitions drove the great events that we now study as impersonal historical forces. The evening light fades now over the great halls where Eleanor once held court, where troubadours once competed for her attention with elaborate verses, and where the whispered conversations between lovers and conspirators once determined the fate of kingdoms. Let her story settle gently in your mind as we prepare to explore the physical traces that medieval people left behind, the hidden carvings, mysterious artifacts, and archaeological discoveries that reveal the more intimate aspects of their lives and the secrets they thought would remain buried forever. Imagine yourself descending into the cool shadows of a medieval cathedral crypt, your footsteps echoing softly against ancient stone as centuries of accumulated silence seem to press around you like a living thing. The air carries the faint scent of old incense, damp limestone, and something indefinable, the accumulated presence of countless generations who once knelt in prayer above your head. Here, beneath the soaring arches and sacred altars, beneath the watchful eyes of carved saints and painted angels, lies a hidden world that tells a very different story about medieval life than the one proclaimed in Sunday sermons. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through narrow windows, you begin to notice details that the original builders never intended for casual observation. Carved into the bases of columns, hidden in the shadows beneath choir stalls, tucked away in corners where only the most dedicated searchers would think to look, are images that speak to the earthier aspects of human nature, images that medieval craftsmen included despite, or perhaps because of, the sacred context that surrounded them. These hidden carvings represent one of the most fascinating and controversial aspects of medieval archaeology, revealing a complex relationship between official religious doctrine and popular culture that is far more nuanced than most people imagine. The medieval church, while officially promoting celibacy and spiritual purity, seems to have tolerated or even encouraged the inclusion of explicitly sexual imagery in sacred spaces, suggesting attitudes toward human sexuality that were both more sophisticated and more contradictory than simple condemnation. The phenomenon of erotic carvings in medieval churches is not isolated to any single region or time period, but appears across Europe from the early medieval period through the late Gothic era. These images range from subtle suggestions to explicit depictions that would make modern viewers blush, yet they were created by craftsmen working under the direct supervision of church authorities and incorporated into buildings that represented the highest achievements of medieval Christian art and architecture. In the Cathedral of Córdoba, now a mosque but originally built as a Christian church, archaeologists have discovered a series of carved capitals that include distinctly sexual imagery interwoven with more traditional Christian symbols. The carvings, dating from the early medieval period, show figures engaged in various intimate activities, but these scenes are presented not as condemnations of sinful behavior, but as celebrations of divine creation and human nature. Similar discoveries have been made in churches across France, where the tradition of carved stone capitals provided medieval craftsmen with opportunities to include imagery that ranged from the playfully suggestive to the startlingly explicit. The Church of Saint Foy at Conques includes carved scenes that appear to celebrate physical love alongside spiritual devotion, while the Cathedral of Autun contains imagery that modern scholars are still debating and interpreting. The famous Sheila na gigs found throughout Ireland and parts of Britain represent perhaps the most widespread example of this phenomenon. These carved female figures, displaying their genitalia in exaggerated and often grotesque fashion, appear on the exterior walls of churches, castles, and other medieval buildings. For centuries, scholars debated their meaning and purpose, with interpretations ranging from fertility symbols to warnings against lust to protective talismans meant to ward off evil spirits. Recent archaeological work has suggested that these figures may have served multiple purposes simultaneously, functioning as fertility symbols for women hoping to conceive, protective devices for buildings and their inhabitants, and complex theological statements about the relationship between physical and spiritual creation. The fact that they appear most commonly on sacred buildings suggests that they were not considered inappropriate or blasphemous by medieval church authorities, but rather served some recognized religious or cultural function. The discovery of frescoed latrines represents another fascinating aspect of medieval attitudes toward sexuality and the body. In Castell'Arquato, a perfectly preserved medieval town in northern Italy, archaeologists have uncovered latrine facilities decorated with elaborate erotic frescoes that would rival anything found in the brothels of ancient Pompeii. These facilities, located within the residential quarters of noble families, were clearly intended for private use rather than public display, yet the care and artistry that went into their decoration suggests that they were valued as more than mere functional spaces. The tradition of decorating latrines with elaborate imagery was not unique to the medieval period, but represented a continuation of practices that had been common in the Roman world too. Archaeological investigations of Roman public latrines have revealed sophisticated mosaic floors depicting mythological scenes with explicit sexual content, suggesting that the medieval practice of decorating such spaces had ancient precedents that influenced medieval attitudes toward privacy, bodily functions, and artistic expression. The frescoes in these private latrines often depict elaborate sexual scenarios involving multiple figures, exotic settings, and fantastical elements that suggest familiarity with erotic literature and artistic traditions from across the medieval world. Some scenes appear to be based on classical mythology, while others seem to draw on contemporary romance literature or folk traditions. The technical skill evident in these works indicates that they were created by accomplished artists rather than crude graffiti, suggesting that wealthy medieval patrons were willing to commission serious artwork for their most private spaces. Similar discoveries have been made in castles across Europe, where private chambers and bathing facilities were often decorated with imagery that celebrated physical pleasure and romantic love. The castle of Vincennes, outside Paris, contains a bathing chamber whose walls were once covered with frescoes depicting scenes from classical love poetry, while excavations at Kenilworth Castle in England have revealed fragments of wall paintings that appear to illustrate contemporary romance literature. These private decorations provide fascinating insights into medieval attitudes toward privacy, intimacy, and the relationship between public and private morality. While medieval people lived much more communal lives than we do today, the wealthy clearly created spaces where they could express aspects of their personality and interests that might not have been appropriate for public display. The interpretation of these archaeological discoveries is complicated by the fact that medieval attitudes toward sexuality were far more complex and varied than is often assumed. The Church's official teachings emphasized celibacy and spiritual purity, but these ideals coexisted with a rich tradition of secular literature that celebrated physical love, a medical tradition that viewed sexual activity as necessary for health, and folk customs that incorporated fertility rituals and sexual symbolism into religious observances. Archaeological evidence suggests that many medieval communities maintained parallel systems of belief and practice, with official religious observances complemented by folk traditions that addressed human needs and desires that formal Christianity could not entirely accommodate. The erotic imagery found in sacred spaces may represent attempts to integrate these different systems, creating a more holistic approach to human spirituality that acknowledged both physical and metaphysical aspects of existence. The discovery of medieval night candles presents another intriguing puzzle for archaeologists and historians attempting to understand the intimate lives of our medieval ancestors. These objects, found in archaeological contexts ranging from peasant hovels to royal palaces, consist of specially shaped candles that appear to have been designed for purposes beyond simple illumination. The candles themselves are typically larger and differently shaped than ordinary medieval candles, with distinctive curves and textures that suggest they may have been intended for intimate use. Chemical analysis of residues found on some of these objects has revealed traces of oils and other substances that would have made them suitable for use as personal lubricants, while their shape and size suggest they may have served as intimate aids for couples or individuals. The production of these specialized candles appears to have been a recognized craft in many medieval communities, with evidence suggesting that they were manufactured by the same artisans who produced ordinary candles and sold alongside other household goods in medieval markets. This suggests that their use was not considered particularly scandalous or hidden, but was simply part of the normal range of products available to medieval consumers. Documentation from medieval guild records indicates that candlemakers in some cities produced specialized products for private use, though the exact nature of these products is described in euphemistic language that makes definitive interpretation difficult. However, the consistency of archaeological finds across different regions and time periods suggests that these objects served recognized functions in medieval intimate life. The question of medieval attitudes toward such objects is complicated by the limited written evidence available. Medical texts from the period occasionally reference the use of various aids and preparations for intimate purposes, but these discussions are typically couched in clinical language that reveals little about social attitudes or common practices. Pilgrimage sites across medieval Europe have yielded some of the most intriguing and controversial archaeological evidence of medieval attitudes toward sexuality and fertility. Many of these sites, which attracted millions of visitors over the centuries, were associated with saints or relics believed to have particular power over human fertility and intimate relationships. The shrine of Saint Bridget in Ireland was famous throughout the medieval period for its supposed ability to restore fertility to barren women and potency to impotent men. Archaeological excavations at the site have revealed thousands of votive offerings left by pilgrims, many of which are explicitly sexual in nature. These offerings include carved representations of male and female genitalia, small sculptures depicting couples engaged in intimate activities, and various objects that appear to have been personal items associated with romantic or sexual relationships. Similar discoveries have been made at pilgrimage sites across Europe, from Santiago de Compostela in Spain to Canterbury in England. The consistency of these finds suggests that the association between pilgrimage and sexual healing was widely recognized and accepted in medieval Europe, despite official church teachings that emphasized spiritual rather than physical concerns. The pilgrims' tales associated with these sites often include stories of miraculous cures for sexual dysfunction, fertility problems, and relationship difficulties. These stories, recorded in various medieval sources, provide fascinating insights into medieval understanding of the relationship between spiritual and physical health, and suggest that many people viewed sexual well-being as an important component of overall spiritual health. The shrine of Saint Fiacre in France became particularly famous for its supposed ability to cure hemorrhoids and other ailments of the lower body, but pilgrims' accounts suggest that many visitors sought the saint's intercession for more intimate problems as well. Archaeological evidence from the site includes numerous votive offerings that appear to relate to sexual and reproductive health, suggesting that the shrine served as an important resource for people seeking help with intimate difficulties. The sacred springs associated with many medieval pilgrimage sites present another fascinating aspect of the relationship between religion and sexuality in medieval culture. These natural water sources, often located near ancient pagan sites that had been Christianized during the early medieval period, were believed to possess miraculous healing properties that extended to intimate and fertility-related problems. The spring at Glastonbury in England was famous throughout medieval Europe for its supposed ability to restore youth and vitality, including sexual vigor. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to bathe in its waters or drink from its source, and many left behind votive offerings that reveal their hopes and concerns about intimate relationships and physical health. Archaeological excavations around these sacred springs have revealed layers of offerings accumulated over centuries, providing a unique window into medieval popular religion and its relationship to human sexuality. The objects found include personal items of jewelry, carved representations of body parts, written prayers and requests, and various items that appear to have been associated with intimate relationships or sexual difficulties. The interpretation of these offerings is complicated by the fact that medieval people often used symbolic language and imagery to discuss intimate matters, making it difficult for modern archaeologists to understand the exact nature of many pilgrims' concerns. However, the consistency of certain types of offerings across different sites and time periods suggests that these shrines played important roles in addressing aspects of human experience that formal religious institutions could not adequately accommodate. Hidden chambers and secret passages in medieval buildings have yielded some of the most intriguing archaeological evidence of private medieval life. These spaces, often discovered only during modern renovation or archaeological investigation, appear to have served as private retreats where medieval people could engage in activities that would not have been appropriate for more public spaces. The castle of Coucy in France contains a series of hidden chambers that were apparently used for private meetings and intimate encounters. The chambers are elaborately decorated with wall paintings that celebrate romantic love and physical pleasure, and they contain furnishings and artifacts that suggest they were designed for comfort and privacy rather than mere concealment. Similar hidden spaces have been discovered in monasteries and convents across Europe, suggesting that even religious institutions recognized the need for private spaces where human emotions and desires could be acknowledged and accommodated. These discoveries have challenged traditional assumptions about medieval religious life and have revealed a more complex and nuanced approach to human sexuality within religious communities. The Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris contains a series of chambers that were apparently used by high-ranking clergy for private meetings and personal retreats. Archaeological investigation of these spaces has revealed artifacts and decorations that suggest a more relaxed attitude toward comfort and pleasure than might be expected in a religious setting. Recent discoveries have expanded our understanding of how widespread such arrangements were in medieval religious institutions. The monastery of Cluny, one of the most influential religious centers of the medieval period, has been found to contain numerous private chambers and passages that allowed residents to move discreetly between different parts of the complex. While not all of these spaces were necessarily used for romantic purposes, their existence suggests that medieval religious communities were more tolerant of human needs and desires than official doctrine might suggest. The discovery of medieval sex toys and intimate accessories in archaeological contexts has provided some of the most direct evidence of medieval attitudes toward physical pleasure and sexual relationships. These objects, typically made from wood, leather, or other organic materials that rarely survive in archaeological contexts, have been preserved in unusual circumstances such as frozen ground, anaerobic environments, or dry conditions that prevented decay. Excavations in London have yielded several examples of medieval sex toys, including carved wooden objects that appear to have been designed for intimate use. These objects show sophisticated craftsmanship and attention to ergonomic design, suggesting that they were produced by skilled artisans rather than crude amateur efforts. The fact that these objects were found in ordinary household contexts rather than in specialized or hidden locations suggests that their use was not considered particularly scandalous or secret. They appear to have been simply part of the normal range of personal items that medieval people might own and use in their private lives. Similar objects have been discovered in archaeological contexts across Europe, from Scandinavian settlements to Mediterranean towns. The consistency of design and manufacture suggests that there may have been established traditions and recognized techniques for producing such items, though written evidence for these traditions is largely absent from surviving medieval sources. The interpretation of medieval erotic art and artifacts is complicated by the fact that modern scholars often bring contemporary assumptions and values to their analysis of these materials. What might appear shocking or inappropriate by modern standards may have had very different meanings and associations for medieval people, who lived in a world with different privacy expectations, different medical understanding, and different religious and cultural frameworks. Medieval medical texts provide some context for understanding these archaeological discoveries, as they reveal a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and sexual function that was based on classical sources, supplemented by practical observation and experience. These texts discuss various aids and preparations for intimate use, suggesting that such items were considered normal and appropriate tools for maintaining physical and emotional health. The medieval understanding of the relationship between physical and spiritual health was far more integrated than is often assumed, with many medical authorities arguing that sexual satisfaction was necessary for overall well-being. This perspective provided a framework for understanding and accepting the use of various aids and accessories that modern observers might find surprising in a supposedly sexually repressive culture. Regional variations in medieval attitudes toward sexuality and intimate relationships are reflected in the archaeological record, with different areas of Europe showing distinct patterns in the types and frequency of erotic artifacts and imagery. Southern European sites, influenced by Islamic and Byzantine cultures, tend to show more sophisticated and elaborate erotic art, while Northern European sites reflect different cultural traditions and aesthetic preferences. The influence of trade routes and cultural exchange on medieval intimate culture is evident in the archaeological record, with exotic materials and foreign artistic styles appearing in erotic contexts throughout Europe. This suggests that medieval people were exposed to and influenced by a wide range of cultural traditions and practices related to sexuality and intimate relationships. The preservation and discovery of medieval erotic materials has been complicated by centuries of deliberate suppression and destruction by later generations who found such materials embarrassing or inappropriate. Victorian archaeologists and historians often destroyed or concealed evidence that conflicted with their assumptions about medieval morality, leading to significant gaps in the archaeological record. Modern archaeological techniques have allowed for the recovery and analysis of materials that previous generations might have overlooked or ignored. Chemical analysis can reveal the original purpose of objects whose function is not immediately obvious, while careful excavation techniques can preserve fragile organic materials that would have been lost in earlier archaeological work. The study of medieval graffiti and informal inscriptions has revealed another aspect of medieval intimate culture that was largely invisible to official sources. Churches, castles, and other medieval buildings often contain informal carvings and inscriptions that reflect the concerns and interests of ordinary people rather than official ideology. These informal inscriptions often include explicit sexual imagery and language that provides direct evidence of medieval attitudes and practices. While such graffiti might be dismissed as the work of rebellious individuals or social outcasts, its widespread occurrence suggests that it reflects broader cultural attitudes and practices. The medieval manuscript tradition has preserved some erotic texts and imagery, though much of this material was deliberately excluded from official collections and has survived only in fragmentary form. Private manuscripts and personal collections sometimes contain materials that reveal sophisticated traditions of erotic literature and art that paralleled the more familiar traditions of religious and secular literature. The famous Exeter Book, a collection of Old English poetry, contains several poems with explicit sexual content that suggests a rich tradition of vernacular erotic literature. These texts, written in sophisticated poetic forms and displaying considerable literary skill, indicate that erotic themes were considered appropriate subjects for serious artistic treatment. Illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period occasionally contain marginal decorations that include erotic imagery, though such decorations were typically subtle and required cultural knowledge to interpret properly. These marginal images often served as commentary on the main text or as expressions of the scribe's personal interests and concerns. The preservation of medieval textiles has occasionally yielded evidence of intimate garments and accessories that reveal aspects of medieval private life that are rarely documented in other sources. These discoveries provide direct evidence of medieval attitudes toward the body, personal hygiene, and intimate relationships. Archaeological investigation of medieval urban sites has revealed evidence of specialized workshops and commercial establishments that catered to intimate needs and desires. These discoveries suggest that medieval towns and cities supported a range of services and products related to sexuality and relationships, despite official restrictions and moral condemnation. The discovery of medieval contraceptive devices and abortifacient preparations in archaeological contexts has provided evidence of medieval attempts to control fertility and manage reproductive health. These findings suggest that medieval people had access to various methods for preventing pregnancy and that such practices were widely known and utilized despite official religious prohibition. Recent advances in archaeological methodology have opened new avenues for investigating medieval intimate life for. The analysis of human remains from medieval cesspits and latrines has revealed information about medieval diets, health conditions, and even gut microbiomes that provide indirect evidence about lifestyle and intimate practices. These techniques allow archaeologists to reconstruct aspects of medieval life that would otherwise remain invisible in the archaeological record. The examination of medieval cesspit contents has revealed not only human waste, but also discarded personal items that provide intimate glimpses into medieval private life. These items, preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the pits, include personal hygiene implements, contraceptive devices, and various objects that appear to have been associated with intimate activities. The development of new chemical analysis techniques has allowed archaeologists to identify residues and traces of substances that were used in medieval intimate practices. These analyses can reveal the composition of lubricants, perfumes, and other preparations that medieval people used to enhance their intimate experiences, providing direct evidence of practices that are rarely documented in written sources. The study of medieval household artifacts has revealed sophisticated approaches to personal hygiene and intimate care that challenge stereotypes about medieval cleanliness and body care. Archaeological evidence suggests that wealthy medieval households possessed a wide range of specialized implements for personal grooming, bathing, and intimate care that rival anything available in the modern world. Medieval mirror fragments, cosmetic containers, and personal grooming implements found in archaeological contexts reveal sophisticated approaches to personal appearance and self-care that extended to intimate aspects of personal presentation. These artifacts suggest that medieval people, particularly the wealthy, devoted considerable attention to maintaining their physical attractiveness and personal hygiene. The discovery of medieval bathing facilities and their associated artifacts has revealed complex practices surrounding personal cleanliness and intimate preparation. These facilities often included specialized areas for different types of personal care, with evidence suggesting that medieval people understood the importance of proper preparation for intimate encounters. Archaeological investigation of medieval pharmacies and medical facilities has revealed evidence of sophisticated approaches to sexual health and reproductive medicine. These sites have yielded collections of medicinal preparations, surgical instruments, and other materials that suggest medieval medical practitioners had considerable knowledge about intimate health issues and were equipped to address a wide range of problems. The study of medieval burial practices has occasionally revealed information about intimate aspects of medieval life, with grave goods and burial arrangements sometimes providing evidence of personal relationships and intimate bonds that are not documented in written sources. These discoveries suggest that medieval people found ways to express and commemorate intimate relationships, even within the constraints of official religious doctrine. Archaeological investigation of medieval households has revealed complex patterns of space use that suggest sophisticated approaches to managing privacy and intimacy within the constraints of communal living arrangements. The arrangement of furniture, the use of textiles and screens, and the organization of domestic spaces all provide evidence of how medieval people created opportunities for private interaction and intimate expression. The discovery of hidden compartments and secret storage areas in medieval buildings has revealed caches of personal items that provide intimate glimpses into medieval private life. These hidden collections often include items that their owners apparently felt needed to be concealed from public view, suggesting aspects of medieval intimate culture that were considered private or potentially controversial. Recent archaeological work has begun to reveal the sophisticated networks of trade and exchange that supported medieval intimate culture. The discovery of exotic materials, imported luxury items, and specialized products in medieval contexts suggests that there was considerable demand for materials and objects related to intimate practices, and that this demand supported extensive commercial networks. The analysis of medieval textile fragments has revealed evidence of specialized garments and accessories that were designed for intimate use. These discoveries provide direct evidence of medieval approaches to intimate presentation and suggest that medieval people had access to a wide range of specialized clothing and accessories for private occasions. Archaeological investigation of medieval workshops and craft centers has revealed evidence of specialized production techniques for objects related to intimate life. These discoveries suggest that medieval artisans developed sophisticated skills and techniques for producing items that enhanced intimate experiences, and that there was sufficient demand for such products to support specialized crafts. The study of medieval household inventories and wills has occasionally revealed references to objects and possessions that appear to relate to intimate aspects of medieval life. While these documents typically use euphemistic language that requires careful interpretation, they provide evidence that medieval people owned and valued various items related to intimate practices. As we consider the archaeological evidence for medieval intimate life, we must remember that we are looking at the material remains of a culture that was far more complex and sophisticated than popular stereotypes suggest. The medieval world contained multiple coexisting traditions and belief systems, with official religious doctrine representing only one aspect of a rich and varied cultural landscape. The physical traces that medieval people left behind in their most private spaces reveal attitudes toward sexuality and intimate relationships that were nuanced, varied, and often surprisingly modern in their acceptance of human desire and physical pleasure. These discoveries remind us that behind the formal structures of medieval society were real people with the same needs, desires, and concerns that characterize human beings in every historical period. The development of new archaeological techniques continues to reveal new aspects of medieval intimate culture, with each discovery adding to our understanding of how medieval people navigated the complex relationships between official doctrine, social expectations, and personal desires. These ongoing discoveries suggest that our understanding of medieval intimate life is still evolving, and that future archaeological work will undoubtedly reveal even more surprising aspects of this fascinating and complex culture. The shadows lengthen now in the ancient crypts and hidden chambers where these secrets have waited for centuries to be discovered. The carved figures smile their enigmatic smiles from cathedral walls, the mysterious candles hold their secrets in museum collections, and the sacred springs continue to flow as they have for 1,000 years. Let these archaeological mysteries settle gently in your mind as we prepare to explore how the great disparities of medieval society, between lord and serf, between wealth and poverty, between power and powerlessness, shaped the most intimate aspects of human experience in the medieval world. As the final shadows of evening settle over the medieval world we have been exploring, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a great castle's outer bailey, where the last light of day illuminates a scene of remarkable social contrast. Before you stretches a landscape that encapsulates the entire hierarchy of medieval society, from the humblest serf's cottage pressed against the castle's outer walls to the soaring towers where lords and ladies conduct their elaborate rituals of power and pleasure. The disparities that defined medieval life extended into every aspect of human experience, including the most intimate moments that shaped individual lives and relationships. The way people loved, courted, married, and expressed their deepest desires was as rigidly stratified as every other aspect of medieval existence, yet within these constraints, human nature found ways to assert itself across all levels of society. In the lowest cottages, where serfs lived lives bound to the soil and the rhythms of agricultural labor, love and desire unfolded in circumstances that would challenge our modern understanding of privacy, comfort, and romantic expression. These small dwellings, typically consisting of a single room shared by entire families, were constructed from whatever materials the local environment provided: timber and daub in forested regions, stone and thatch where wood was scarce, always built with an eye toward economy and function rather than comfort or beauty. The serf's cottage was a world unto itself, measuring perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, with walls of wattle and daub that provided minimal insulation against the elements. The floor was typically bare earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that served multiple purposes, providing a small measure of warmth underfoot, absorbing moisture and waste, and offering a place where family members could sleep huddled together for warmth during the long winter months. Within these cramped quarters, privacy was a luxury that simply did not exist. Parents and children, grandparents and young adults, all shared the same space, sleeping in piles of straw or on simple pallets that could be moved and rearranged as circumstances required. The concept of personal space was foreign to this world, where survival depended on cooperation and shared resources, and where individual desires had to be subordinated to the needs of the family unit. The daily routines that governed peasant life created natural rhythms for intimate interaction that were dictated more by practical necessity than romantic inclination. The working day began before dawn, with couples rising together in the darkness to tend animals, prepare food, and begin the countless tasks that sustained rural existence. These early morning hours, before children woke and before the demands of the day became overwhelming, often provided the only opportunity for private conversation and physical intimacy between married couples. The sharing of basic daily tasks created opportunities for subtle expressions of affection and desire that had to be communicated through glances, touches, and brief moments of physical proximity. A wife grinding grain while her husband prepared tools for the day's work might brush against him in passing, communicating volumes through a simple touch that could not be expressed more openly in the presence of their children and other family members. Even the most basic activities of daily life, washing, dressing, eating, were necessarily communal affairs that required careful management to preserve any sense of intimacy or privacy. Couples learned to communicate through subtle signals and coded language that allowed them to express their feelings and coordinate their private moments without alerting other family members to their intentions. Yet even in these constrained circumstances, young people found ways to court and form romantic attachments. The process was necessarily different from the elaborate rituals of courtly love that characterized noble society, shaped instead by the practical realities of agricultural life and the constant oversight of close-knit rural communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Courtship among the peasantry often began during the shared labor that characterized rural life. Young men and women worked side by side in the fields, tending animals, gathering fuel, and performing the countless tasks that sustained rural communities. These work environments provided opportunities for conversation, for the exchange of glances and small gestures that could communicate interest and attraction despite the presence of parents, siblings, and neighbors. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life created natural cycles in romantic and intimate behavior that reflected the changing demands and opportunities of rural existence. Spring brought not only the renewal of plant and animal life, but also increased social interaction as communities emerged from the isolation of winter and began the cooperative work of planting and early cultivation. During these spring months, young people who had been largely confined to their family cottages throughout the winter had opportunities to meet and interact with potential romantic partners from other households. The shared work of preparing fields, planting crops, and tending to animals that had been kept indoors during the cold months created natural occasions for conversation and flirtation that were more difficult to arrange during other seasons. Summer brought its own opportunities and challenges for intimate relationships among the peasantry. The longer days and warmer weather made it possible for couples to steal moments of privacy outdoors, away from the crowded confines of their family dwellings. The extensive work required during the growing season, weeding, harvesting early crops, tending animals in distant pastures, created legitimate reasons for young people to spend time away from direct parental supervision. The summer festivals that marked important points in the agricultural calendar provided particularly important opportunities for courtship and romantic expression. These celebrations, often centered around religious observances but incorporating ancient traditions of community celebration, created relaxed social atmospheres where normal rules of behavior could be temporarily suspended or modified. The feast of St. John's Eve, celebrated at midsummer, was particularly associated with romantic activities and courtship rituals. Young couples would gather herbs and flowers that were believed to possess magical properties related to love and fertility, participate in bonfires and dancing that encouraged physical proximity and emotional expression, and engage in various games and contests that provided opportunities for flirtation and romantic display. Harvest time represented the culmination of the agricultural year and created the most significant opportunities for romantic celebration and marriage arrangements. The successful completion of the harvest ensured that communities would have adequate food supplies for the winter and provided the economic security necessary to support new marriages and households. The harvest festivals that marked the end of the agricultural season were times of genuine community celebration, when the normal constraints of daily life were relaxed and people could indulge in pleasures that were normally restricted by the demands of constant labor. These celebrations often included elaborate feasts, dancing, music, and various forms of entertainment that created opportunities for romantic interaction and courtship. Winter brought its own particular challenges and opportunities for intimate life among the peasantry. The shorter days and harsh weather that confined families to their dwellings for extended periods created intense conditions for intimate relationships. Couples had to navigate their physical and emotional needs within the constraints of shared living spaces where privacy was virtually impossible and where the stresses of winter survival could strain even the strongest relationships. The long winter evenings, when outdoor work was impossible and families gathered around their fires for warmth and light, became important times for intimate conversation and emotional bonding. These hours provided opportunities for storytelling, music, and other forms of entertainment that strengthened family bonds and allowed couples to maintain their emotional connections despite the physical and economic stresses of winter survival. The phenomenon of bundling or night visits that developed in many rural communities represented a sophisticated approach to managing the tension between the need for young people to evaluate potential marriage partners and the community's interest in maintaining moral standards and social stability. These customs, which varied significantly between regions and communities, typically allowed young couples to spend time together in semi-private settings under carefully controlled circumstances. In some communities, courting couples were permitted to share a bed while fully clothed and separated by physical barriers such as bundling boards or wrapped in separate blankets. These arrangements allowed for intimate conversation and physical closeness while theoretically preventing more complete sexual contact. The practice was typically supervised by parents or other community members who ensured that appropriate boundaries were maintained. The practical wisdom behind such customs reflected the reality that young people needed opportunities to develop emotional bonds and evaluate their compatibility as marriage partners, while communities needed to maintain control over reproductive behavior and ensure that marriages served broader social and economic functions. The apparent contradictions in these arrangements, encouraging intimacy while preventing its full expression, reflected the complex negotiation between individual desires and social necessities that characterized all aspects of medieval life. Marriage among the peasantry was typically a community affair that reflected the economic realities of rural life more than romantic attachment. Young people might have some input into the selection of their spouses, but the final decisions were usually made by parents and community elders who considered factors such as land holdings, family reputation, and the potential contribution of the marriage to community stability and prosperity. The economics of peasant marriage were necessarily simple and practical. Dowries consisted of whatever household goods, livestock, or small amounts of land or money that families could spare, and wedding celebrations were modest affairs that reflected the limited resources available to rural communities. However, these economic constraints did not prevent families from attempting to create meaningful celebrations that honored the importance of marriage in community life. The marriage ceremony itself was often a simple affair, conducted with whatever level of religious observance the community could afford, and arranged around the agricultural calendar to minimize disruption to essential work. The celebration might consist of nothing more than a shared meal and perhaps some music or dancing, with the entire community contributing what they could to mark the occasion. The wedding night, for peasant couples, typically took place in the same single room that would house their extended family, with minimal privacy and constant awareness of the presence of others. The consummation of marriage was understood to be necessary for the legal and social validity of the union, but the circumstances under which it occurred were far removed from the romantic ideals celebrated in noble literature. The ongoing intimate life of peasant couples continued to unfold within these constraints of limited privacy, shared living spaces, and constant community oversight. Sexual relations between married couples had to be conducted quietly and discreetly, always with the awareness that children, parents, and other family members were sleeping nearby. The timing of intimate encounters was often determined by practical considerations. When other family members were absent, during brief periods of privacy while performing necessary tasks, or in the early morning hours before the day's work began. The Church's teachings about appropriate sexual behavior within marriage applied to peasants as well as nobles, but the practical realities of rural life made strict adherence to official doctrine difficult if not impossible. Priests might preach about the importance of moderation in marital relations and the need to avoid sexual activity during religious seasons, but they also understood that peasant families needed children to contribute to agricultural labor and provide security in old age. The Catholic Church's complex relationship with peasant sexuality reflected broader tensions between official doctrine and practical necessity that characterized medieval religious life. While church law insisted on the same moral standards for all Christians regardless of social class, the practical application of these standards often varied significantly depending on circumstances and local customs. Rural priests, who often came from peasant backgrounds themselves and lived in close proximity to their parishioners, developed practical approaches to moral guidance that acknowledged the realities of peasant life while maintaining the basic principles of Christian teaching. These priests understood that the ideal of celibacy promoted by the Church was neither practical nor desirable for the vast majority of their parishioners, whose survival depended on large families and whose communities needed stable marriages to maintain social order. Confession, which became increasingly important in medieval religious practice, provided priests with intimate knowledge of their parishioners' private lives and moral struggles. The confessional booth, though not yet developed in its modern form, created a private space where peasants could discuss their most personal concerns and receive guidance about appropriate behavior. The records of medieval confessional manuals and penitential guides reveal the extent to which priests were expected to inquire about and provide guidance regarding sexual behavior. These documents suggest that medieval clergy had detailed knowledge of the intimate practices of their parishioners and were prepared to address a wide range of questions and concerns about marital relations, reproductive health, and sexual morality. For peasant women, the experience of sexuality and intimacy was shaped by additional factors that reflected their subordinate position within both the social hierarchy and the family structure. Women were expected to submit to their husband's authority in all matters, including intimate relations, and had little legal recourse if they were mistreated or abused. The daily routine of peasant women was dominated by an endless cycle of domestic tasks that began before dawn and continued until well after dark. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, textile production, food preservation, and countless other activities left little time or energy for personal concerns or romantic pursuits. Within this demanding schedule, intimate relationships had to be fitted around practical necessities rather than being given priority for their own sake. pregnancy and childbirth, occurring with regularity in peasant households, represented both the fulfillment of women's expected role and a source of considerable danger and discomfort. Medieval peasant women typically gave birth with the assistance of other women in the community, relying on traditional knowledge and practices that had been passed down through generations of female experience. The high infant mortality rates that characterized medieval life meant that peasant couples had to balance their desire for children who would contribute to the family's economic well-being with the reality that many children would not survive to adulthood. This created a complex emotional landscape where parents had to invest enough in their children to ensure proper care while protecting themselves from the devastating grief that would follow frequent infant deaths. The experiences of widowhood and remarriage among the peasantry reflected the harsh economic realities that governed rural life. A woman who lost her husband faced the prospect of trying to maintain a household and raise children without the male labor that was essential for agricultural work. Remarriage was often a practical necessity rather than a romantic choice, with widows typically marrying men who could provide the economic support and physical labor needed for survival. In stark contrast to the constrained and communal intimate life of the peasantry, the nobility inhabited a world where privacy was possible, luxury was expected, and intimate relationships were conducted within elaborate frameworks of ritual, ceremony, and cultural sophistication. The physical environment alone created possibilities for intimate expression that were unimaginable in peasant cottages. The architecture of noble residences was designed to accommodate not only the practical needs of daily life, but also the complex social rituals that characterized aristocratic existence. Castle halls, private chambers, gardens, and chapels provided a variety of spaces where different types of intimate interaction could occur, from public displays of courtly behavior to completely private romantic encounters. The private chambers of medieval nobles were designed to accommodate not only sleeping, but also the complex social rituals that characterized aristocratic life. These rooms, often located in the upper levels of castle towers or manor houses, were furnished with expensive tapestries that provided both decoration and insulation, carpets imported from distant lands, and furniture crafted by skilled artisans using precious materials. The bed itself was often the most valuable piece of furniture in a noble household, constructed with elaborate carved wooden frames, expensive mattresses filled with feathers or other luxury materials, and surrounded by curtains that could be drawn to create a private space within the larger chamber. These bed hangings served multiple purposes. They provided warmth in drafty stone buildings, offered privacy for intimate conversations and activities, and displayed the wealth and status of their owners through expensive fabrics and elaborate decoration. The process of preparing for bed in a noble household was itself a complex ritual that involved multiple servants and careful attention to personal hygiene and appearance. Ladies would be assisted in removing their elaborate gowns and jewelry, washing with scented water, and donning special sleeping garments that were designed for both comfort and attractiveness. The luxury items available to wealthy nobles included imported soaps and perfumes, specialized cosmetics and beauty treatments, and various accessories designed to enhance physical attractiveness and intimate appeal. These items, obtained through extensive trade networks that connected medieval Europe to distant parts of the world, represented a level of sophistication and refinement that was completely foreign to peasant experience. The daily routines of noble life created natural opportunities for intimate interaction that were enhanced rather than constrained by luxury and leisure. Noble couples could spend extended periods in private conversation, engage in elaborate courtship rituals, and develop sophisticated approaches to romantic expression that required both time and cultural knowledge to appreciate fully. The role of servants in noble intimate life created complex dynamics that had no parallel in peasant society. Personal servants, particularly ladies' maids and valets, were necessarily involved in the most private aspects of their masters' and mistresses' lives, helping with bathing, dressing, and other intimate activities while maintaining the discretion necessary to preserve their employer's privacy and dignity. These servants often served as intermediaries in romantic relationships, carrying messages between lovers, arranging secret meetings, and providing the practical support necessary for elaborate courtship rituals. The loyalty and discretion of personal servants was essential for maintaining the complex web of relationships and alliances that characterized noble society. The courtship rituals of the nobility unfolded within elaborate social frameworks that emphasized ceremony, cultural sophistication, and the complex interplay between personal desire and political necessity. Unlike peasant courtship, which was shaped primarily by practical considerations and community oversight, noble courtship involved multiple layers of meaning and significance that extended far beyond the individuals involved. The tradition of courtly love that developed in medieval noble courts created elaborate codes of behavior that governed romantic interactions between men and women of the upper classes. These codes emphasized the spiritual and emotional aspects of love while acknowledging the powerful physical attractions that drew couples together. The seasonal cycles that governed noble intimate life were shaped not by agricultural necessity, but by the social calendar of court life, with its succession of festivals, ceremonies, and political gatherings that created opportunities for romantic interaction and courtship. The Christmas court, Easter celebrations, summer tournaments, and harvest festivals provided natural occasions for elaborate displays of courtly behavior and romantic expression. The correspondence between noble lovers often took the form of elaborate literary compositions that demonstrated not only romantic attachment, but also cultural sophistication and intellectual achievement. These letters and poems were carefully crafted to communicate multiple levels of meaning, often including coded references to political situations, family relationships, and social expectations that required considerable cultural knowledge to interpret properly. The physical spaces where noble courtship unfolded were designed to accommodate these elaborate social rituals. Great halls provided venues for public displays of courtly behavior, while private gardens offered opportunities for more intimate conversations. The architectural features of castles and manor houses, alcoves, window seats, private chapels, and hidden passages created numerous opportunities for couples to meet privately while maintaining the appearance of propriety. The marriage arrangements of the nobility involved complex negotiations between families that considered not only the personal preferences of the individuals involved, but also the political, economic, and strategic implications of the union. These negotiations often extended over years and involved multiple levels of diplomacy that could affect the balance of power between regions or even entire kingdoms. The economics of noble marriage involved vast transfers of wealth, land, and political influence that dwarfed anything imaginable in peasant society. Dowries might include entire territories, valuable trade rights, or strategic military alliances that could reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The wedding ceremonies of the nobility were elaborate affairs that served multiple purposes. They celebrated the union of two individuals, demonstrated the wealth and power of their families, and created public records of alliances that would have long-term political implications. These ceremonies often lasted for days and included banquets, tournaments, musical performances, and other entertainments that showcased the cultural sophistication of the aristocratic class. The wedding night for noble couples typically took place in specially prepared chambers that had been decorated for the occasion with the finest furnishings and appointments available. The consummation of the marriage was often witnessed by representatives of both families to ensure the legal validity of the union, though these witnesses remained outside the actual bedchamber. The ongoing intimate lives of noble couples unfolded within private chambers that provided genuine privacy and comfort unknown to the lower classes. These spaces were heated by fireplaces or braziers, furnished with comfortable seating and sleeping arrangements, and equipped with various luxury items designed to enhance physical comfort and emotional intimacy. The availability of privacy allowed noble couples to develop intimate relationships that could be more spontaneous and expressive than those of peasants who lived under constant community oversight. The luxury of time, freed from the demanding physical labor that characterized peasant life, provided opportunities for elaborate courtship rituals and extended intimate encounters that required leisure and comfort to develop fully. However, the intimate lives of the nobility were constrained by their own sets of expectations and obligations that could be as restrictive as those faced by peasants. The political significance of noble marriages meant that spouses were expected to fulfill certain roles and maintain certain appearances regardless of their personal preferences or emotional attachments. The phenomenon of courtly love often developed precisely because official marriages were arranged for political reasons and might not provide the emotional satisfaction that individuals sought. The elaborate literary and cultural traditions that celebrated extramarital romantic attachment reflected the reality that many nobles found their deepest emotional connections outside their formal marriages. The Church's relationship with noble sexuality was complicated by the political power and economic influence of the aristocratic class. While Church doctrine applied equally to all Christians, the practical enforcement of moral standards often varied depending on the social status and political importance of the individuals involved. The private confessors who served noble households often found themselves in delicate positions where their religious obligations to promote moral behavior conflicted with their dependence on aristocratic patronage. These priests had to navigate carefully between their spiritual duties and the political realities that governed their positions. The confessions of nobles, conducted in private chambers or personal oratories rather than in public churches, often involved complex moral questions that reflected the sophisticated and sometimes contradictory nature of aristocratic life. These private religious consultations might address questions about marital obligations, extramarital relationships, political alliances, and the various ways in which personal desires intersected with social expectations. The records of medieval confessional literature suggest that noble confessions often read like elaborate narratives of political intrigue and romantic complication. The moral questions that arose in aristocratic life were often more complex than those faced by peasants, involving multiple layers of obligation and competing loyalties that required sophisticated theological and moral reasoning to resolve. The phenomenon of clerical involvement in noble love affairs was not uncommon, with priests sometimes serving as intermediaries, advisors, or even participants in the romantic intrigues that characterized aristocratic society. These involvements reflected the complex relationships between secular and religious authority that characterized medieval society, and the ways in which personal relationships crossed institutional boundaries. The experiences of aging and widowhood among the nobility created different challenges and opportunities than those faced by peasants in similar circumstances. Noble widows often retained control of significant wealth and property, giving them more options for independence and remarriage than their peasant counterparts. However, they also faced political pressures and family obligations that could constrain their choices and force them into arrangements that served broader political purposes rather than personal preferences. The contrast between noble and peasant approaches to sexuality and intimacy reflects broader patterns of social differentiation that characterized medieval society. The availability of privacy, luxury, and leisure time created possibilities for intimate expression among the nobility that were simply impossible for those who lived under the constraints of poverty and constant labor. Yet within both social groups, human nature found ways to assert itself and create meaningful intimate relationships despite the various constraints and limitations imposed by social expectations, economic necessity, and religious doctrine. The universality of human desires and emotions transcended social boundaries, even when the opportunities for their expression varied dramatically between different levels of society. The records of medieval life, fragmentary and biased though they are, suggest that both nobles and peasants found ways to create intimate bonds and express physical and emotional attraction within the constraints of their respective circumstances. The forms of these expressions varied significantly, but the underlying human needs and desires remained constant across social boundaries. As we consider the contrasts between the intimate lives of different social classes in medieval society, we are reminded that human nature transcends social boundaries and historical periods. The specific forms that love and desire take may vary according to circumstances, but the underlying emotions and needs remain constant across time and social position. The medieval world, with all its constraints and limitations, provided the stage for human dramas of love, passion, betrayal, and commitment that resonate with universal themes of human experience. The stories of peasant couples stealing moments of intimacy under the open sky and noble lovers conducting elaborate courtships in private chambers remind us that the fundamental experiences of human intimacy persist despite changing social conditions and cultural expectations. The evening shadows have deepened now around the castle walls, where the lights in the great hall have dimmed and the sounds of daily life have given way to the quiet murmur of intimate conversations and whispered endearments. In the humblest cottages and the grandest chambers, across all the divisions that defined medieval society, human hearts continue to beat with the same desires and longings that have characterized our species throughout history. Let these contrasts and connections settle gently in your mind as you rest, carried by the knowledge that the human experiences of love, desire, and intimate connection transcend the boundaries of time and social position, linking us across the centuries to those who came before us and faced the eternal challenges of finding meaning and connection in the brief span of human life. As the last echoes of our medieval journey fade into the gentle quiet of evening, imagine yourself one final time standing at the threshold between past and present, between the world we have explored together and the comfortable sanctuary of your modern life. The stone walls that have witnessed centuries of human drama grow dim in the gathering twilight, their ancient secrets settling back into the peaceful silence from which we briefly awakened them. We have traveled together through a world that seems at once utterly foreign and surprisingly familiar. A world where the fundamental experiences of human love, desire, and connection played out against a backdrop of social arrangements, physical constraints, and cultural expectations that were radically different from our own, yet where the basic rhythms of the human heart remained remarkably constant across the centuries that separate us from our medieval ancestors. In the dim glow of oil lamps and candles that once illuminated medieval chambers, we have glimpsed the intimate lives of people who lived and loved within circumstances that would challenge our modern understanding of privacy, comfort, and individual freedom. Yet what emerges most clearly from our exploration is not the strangeness of medieval life, but rather the persistence of human nature itself, the way that love finds expression even within the most constraining circumstances, the way that desire transcends social boundaries and cultural limitations, and the way that the need for intimate connection remains constant across all the variations of human social organization. The daily realities we explored in our first journey through medieval life, the challenges of maintaining personal hygiene without running water, the intimacy forced by crowded living conditions, the seasonal rhythms that governed both work and love, remind us how different the physical circumstances of life once were. Yet within these constraints, medieval people developed sophisticated approaches to courtship, marriage, and intimate expression that reveal the same creativity, passion, and emotional complexity that characterize human relationships in any era. Consider how the medieval understanding of cleanliness and the body reflected not ignorance or primitiveness, but rather a different relationship with the physical world than we maintain today. The infrequent bathing that characterized medieval life was not simply a matter of choosing to be dirty, but rather a reflection of the enormous effort required to heat water, the scarcity of fuel, and the practical recognition that resources had to be allocated carefully to ensure survival. Within these constraints, medieval people developed complex rituals around personal care and physical presentation that served many of the same psychological and social functions that our modern beauty routines serve today. The shared living spaces that defined medieval domestic life created forms of intimacy and family bonding that are largely foreign to our contemporary experience. The necessity of sleeping together for warmth, working together for survival, and sharing the most basic activities of daily life created emotional bonds and mutual dependencies that were both more intense and more enduring than the relationships that characterize our more individualized modern lives. Yet these same arrangements also created challenges for romantic and sexual expression that required remarkable creativity and discretion to overcome. The young couples who found moments of privacy during evening tasks, who developed elaborate codes of glances and gestures to communicate their feelings, and who learned to express their deepest emotions within the constraints of constant community oversight demonstrate a sophistication in human relationships that challenges any assumption that emotional complexity is a modern invention. The questions we considered about feudal customs and the supposed rights of lords over their subjects reveal the complex relationship between power and desire that has characterized human societies throughout history. While the specific forms that sexual exploitation and coercion have taken have varied across cultures and historical periods, the fundamental dynamics of power and vulnerability that shape intimate relationships remain disturbingly constant. The medieval world, with its elaborate hierarchies and rigid social boundaries, provided particular opportunities for the abuse of power, but it also developed cultural and legal mechanisms for limiting such abuse and protecting the most vulnerable members of society. The legendary Droit du Seigneur that we examined serves as a powerful reminder of how historical myths can distort our understanding of the past while revealing important truths about the concerns and anxieties of different historical periods. Whether or not feudal lords actually claimed sexual rights over their vassals' wives may be less important than the fact that such stories captured the imagination of later generations and served as symbols of feudal oppression and social injustice. The persistence of these stories across centuries suggests that they addressed real anxieties about the abuse of power and the vulnerability of the powerless that transcend any particular historical circumstance. The modern discussions of sexual harassment, consent, and power dynamics in intimate relationships echo many of the same concerns that medieval people expressed through their stories about tyrannical lords and exploited peasants. The morning sounds that once awakened medieval sleepers, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, the creak of water wheels, have long since been replaced by the gentler hum of modern technology, yet the human hearts that once quickened to the sight of a beloved face or the touch of a caring hand beat with the same rhythms that move us today. The emotions that drove medieval people to create elaborate rituals of courtship, to compose passionate love letters, and to risk social disapproval for the sake of romantic attachment are the same emotions that continue to shape our own intimate relationships. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval intimate life created natural patterns of courtship, marriage, and family formation that connected human reproductive behavior to the broader cycles of the natural world. The spring festivals that brought communities together for planting, the summer celebrations that allowed young people to meet and court, the harvest feasts that provided resources for new marriages, and the long winter evenings that drew families together around their fires. All of these seasonal markers created a framework for intimate life that was deeply integrated with the natural environment and the practical requirements of survival. Modern life, with its artificial lighting, climate control, and independence from agricultural cycles, has largely severed these connections between human intimate behavior and natural rhythms. Yet many people still feel the pull of seasonal changes on their emotional lives, the way that spring awakens romantic feelings, summer encourages social interaction, autumn suggests the comfort of home and family, and winter draws us toward intimate bonds that provide warmth and security. Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose remarkable life we followed through the halls of medieval power, exemplifies the way individual personality and determination could transcend even the most restrictive social circumstances. Her story reminds us that behind the grand movements of political history were real people whose personal choices and romantic attachments had consequences that extended far beyond their private lives. The letters she exchanged with troubadours, the political alliances she forged through marriage and diplomacy, and the cultural innovations she sponsored during her long life demonstrate the sophisticated interplay between personal desire and public responsibility that has always characterized leadership. Eleanor's early life in Aquitaine, surrounded by the sophisticated culture of the troubadour courts, shaped her understanding of the relationship between power and pleasure, intellect and emotion, public duty and private fulfillment in ways that would influence her throughout her long career. The education she received in music, poetry, and the arts of courtly conversation prepared her not only for the social requirements of noble life, but also for the complex negotiations and diplomatic challenges that would define her political career. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France illustrates the profound cultural differences that could exist within medieval Europe and the ways in which incompatible personalities and expectations could doom even the most politically advantageous unions. The contrast between Louis's monastic inclinations and Eleanor's sophisticated court culture represents in microcosm the broader tension between ascetic religious ideals and the worldly concerns that necessarily occupied the attention of medieval rulers. The scandal surrounding Eleanor's relationship with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers during the Second Crusade reveals the complex dynamics of medieval court life, where personal relationships were always subject to political interpretation, and where the boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate behavior were constantly negotiated and renegotiated according to circumstances and competing interests. Eleanor's correspondence with the troubadours of her court reveals a woman of remarkable intellectual sophistication who understood how to use the cultural tools of her time to express emotions and ideas that might otherwise have been constrained by social convention. The elaborate language of courtly love that developed around her circle was not merely a literary game or social affectation, but a serious attempt to create new forms of relationship between men and women that acknowledged female intelligence, emotional complexity, and spiritual equality in ways that conventional medieval social arrangements could not accommodate. The passionate attachment between Eleanor and Henry II, which began with such promise and ended in such bitterness, illustrates the way that intimate relationships could become entangled with the larger political forces that shaped medieval Europe. Their personal conflicts were played out on a stage that included most of the known world, with consequences that affected the lives of millions of people who never knew their names. Yet at its heart, their story was one of two strong-willed individuals who loved passionately, disagreed fundamentally, and ultimately found themselves unable to reconcile their personal needs with their public responsibilities. The early years of their marriage, marked by remarkable political success and apparent personal happiness, demonstrate the potential for intimate relationships to enhance and support ambitious political projects. Eleanor's wealth and territories provided Henry with the resources he needed to pursue his claim to the English throne, while his energy and vision offered her the political partnership and intellectual stimulation that had been lacking in her first marriage. The cultural renaissance that flourished around their court during these years represents one of the great achievements of medieval civilization, bringing together scholars, artists, and poets from across Europe to create new forms of literature, music, and artistic expression that would influence Western culture for centuries. Eleanor's role in sponsoring and directing these cultural developments reveals her sophisticated understanding of the relationship between political power and cultural achievement. The gradual deterioration of their relationship, culminating in Eleanor's support for her son's rebellion against their father, illustrates the way that personal and political conflicts could become inextricably intertwined in medieval court life. The specific causes of their estrangement, whether rooted in Henry's infidelities, Eleanor's political ambitions, or simply the inevitable tensions that arise when two strong personalities attempt to share power, may be less important than the broader pattern of how intimate relationships were shaped by the public responsibilities and political pressures that govern noble life. Eleanor's long imprisonment, which lasted for nearly 16 years, demonstrates both the vulnerability of women within medieval political structures and the remarkable resilience that allowed some individuals to survive and eventually overcome even the most difficult circumstances. Her ability to maintain her political networks, communicate with allies, and coordinate resistance activities while remaining technically captive reveals the sophisticated understanding of power and influence that had characterized her entire career. The eventual reconciliation between Eleanor and her sons, and her emergence from captivity to play crucial roles in the politics of the late medieval period, demonstrate the enduring power of family bonds and personal relationships to transcend even the most bitter political conflicts. Her final years, spent in the relative peace of Fontevraud Abbey, suggest a woman who had learned to find satisfaction in spiritual and intellectual pursuits after a lifetime of political and romantic drama. The archaeological discoveries that form the focus of our third exploration reveal aspects of medieval life that were largely invisible in the written records left by official sources. The hidden carvings in cathedral walls, the elaborate decorations in private latrines, the mysterious objects whose purposes we can only guess at, all of these physical traces speak to the complexity and sophistication of medieval approaches to sexuality and intimate expression. These archaeological findings challenge many of our assumptions about medieval attitudes toward the body, physical pleasure, and the relationship between sacred and secular aspects of human experience. The presence of explicitly sexual imagery in church buildings suggests that medieval religious authorities had a more nuanced understanding of human nature than is often assumed, recognizing that spiritual and physical aspects of human experience were interconnected rather than opposed. The tradition of including erotic imagery in sacred spaces may have reflected ancient pagan practices that were gradually incorporated into Christian worship, or it may have represented a sophisticated theological understanding of the relationship between divine creation and human reproduction. The fact that such imagery was typically hidden or placed in locations where it would not be immediately visible to casual observers suggests that its inclusion was deliberate and meaningful rather than accidental or transgressive. The discovery of elaborately decorated private latrines reveals the extent to which medieval people were willing to invest artistic effort and financial resources in spaces that were designed for the most basic bodily functions. The erotic frescoes found in these private facilities suggest attitudes toward the body and its functions that were more accepting and celebratory than the supposedly repressive approach often attributed to medieval Christianity. The technical skill and artistic sophistication evident in these private decorations indicate that they were created by accomplished artists rather than crude amateurs, suggesting that wealthy medieval patrons were willing to commission serious artwork for their most intimate spaces. The fact that such decorations were apparently common in upper-class households across Europe suggests that they reflected widespread cultural attitudes rather than individual eccentricities. The pilgrimage sites we visited, with their associations with fertility, sexual healing, and romantic fulfillment, reveal the extent to which medieval people integrated their intimate concerns with their spiritual lives. The votive offerings left by hopeful pilgrims, the stories of miraculous cures for sexual dysfunction and relationship problems, and the elaborate rituals that developed around sacred springs and healing shrines all testify to a religious culture that acknowledged and addressed the full range of human needs and desires. The thousands of votive offerings that archaeologists have discovered at these sites provide direct evidence of the concerns and hopes that medieval people brought to their spiritual practices. The carved representations of body parts, the personal items associated with romantic relationships, and the written prayers that explicitly request divine intervention in intimate matters all demonstrate the extent to which medieval spirituality encompassed physical as well as metaphysical concerns. The consistency of these findings across different regions and time periods suggests that the association between pilgrimage and sexual healing was a widespread and long-lasting aspect of medieval popular religion. The fact that church authorities apparently tolerated or even encouraged these practices indicates that official Christianity was more flexible and accommodating in its approach to human sexuality than is often assumed. The specialized objects and preparations that archaeological investigation has revealed, the mysterious night candles, the intimate accessories, the sophisticated beauty treatments, demonstrate that medieval people had access to a wide range of products and services designed to enhance their intimate lives. The fact that such items were produced by recognized craftsmen and sold in ordinary markets suggests that their use was considered normal and appropriate rather than scandalous or hidden. The chemical analysis of residues found on medieval intimate accessories has revealed sophisticated knowledge of lubricants, perfumes, and other preparations that enhanced physical pleasure and comfort. The consistency of these preparations across different regions suggests that there were established traditions and recognized recipes for producing such items, though written evidence for these practices is largely absent from surviving sources. The regional variations in these archaeological findings remind us that medieval Europe was not a monolithic culture, but rather a complex mosaic of different traditions, influences, and approaches to intimate life. The influence of Islamic culture in Spain, Byzantine traditions in Italy, and various folk customs throughout northern Europe created a rich diversity of practices and attitudes that defies simple generalization about medieval sexuality. The preservation of medieval manuscripts containing erotic literature and imagery provides additional evidence of sophisticated approaches to intimate expression that paralleled the more familiar traditions of religious and secular literature. These texts, often preserved in private collections rather than institutional libraries, reveal complex literary traditions that celebrated physical pleasure alongside spiritual devotion. The social contrasts we explored in our final segment, the vast differences between the intimate lives of serfs and sovereigns, illustrate the way that social position shaped every aspect of human experience in the medieval world. Yet what emerges most clearly from this comparison is not simply the advantages enjoyed by the wealthy and powerful, but rather the remarkable creativity with which people at all social levels found ways to express their deepest emotions and fulfill their most basic human needs. The peasant couples who stole moments of intimacy during their endless round of agricultural labor, who developed elaborate customs of courtship that fit within the constraints of community oversight, and who created meaningful marriages within the limited options available to them demonstrate the same capacity for love, passion, and emotional commitment that characterized their social superiors. The fact that their expressions of these emotions took different forms, shaped by material constraints and social expectations, does not diminish their fundamental humanity or emotional authenticity. The annual cycle of agricultural work created natural rhythms for peasant intimate life that were deeply connected to the broader patterns of rural existence. The spring planting that brought communities together for cooperative work, the summer festivals that provided opportunities for courtship and celebration, the harvest activities that determined the economic viability of new marriages, and the long winter months that drew families together in their cramped cottages. All of these seasonal patterns created a framework for intimate relationships that was organic and sustainable in ways that modern urban life often lacks. The customs of bundling and supervised courtship that developed in many peasant communities represent sophisticated solutions to the challenge of allowing young people to form emotional bonds while maintaining community control over reproductive behavior. These practices acknowledge both the importance of emotional compatibility in marriage and the community's legitimate interest in ensuring that marriages serve broader social and economic functions. The marriage ceremonies of the peasantry, simple though they might be in terms of material luxury, often reflected deep community investment in the success of new unions. The shared meals, collective celebrations, and communal gifts that marked peasant weddings created social bonds and mutual obligations that supported new couples through the challenges of establishing independent households. The ongoing intimate lives of peasant couples, conducted within the constraints of shared living spaces and constant community oversight, required forms of discretion and creativity that are foreign to modern experience. The development of subtle communication systems, the careful timing of private moments, and the creation of emotional intimacy within physical constraints all demonstrate sophisticated approaches to relationship management that modern couples might find instructive. The nobility, with their elaborate courtship rituals, private chambers, and sophisticated cultural traditions, certainly enjoyed greater opportunities for romantic expression and intimate luxury. Yet their lives were constrained by different but equally demanding sets of expectations and obligations. The political significance of noble marriages, the constant surveillance of court life, and the complex web of family and feudal loyalties that governed aristocratic behavior created their own forms of limitation and constraint. The architecture of noble residences was deliberately designed to accommodate the complex social rituals that characterized aristocratic life. The great halls that provided venues for public display, the private chambers that allowed for intimate conversation, the gardens and walkways that created opportunities for courtship, and the elaborate decorative schemes that demonstrated wealth and cultural sophistication. All of these architectural elements worked together to create environments that supported the sophisticated social interactions that defined noble culture. The luxury items available to wealthy nobles, imported fabrics, exotic perfumes, elaborate jewelry, and sophisticated cosmetics, served not only as displays of wealth and status, but also as tools for intimate expression and romantic appeal. The care and expense that nobles invested in their physical appearance and personal presentation reflects the understanding that attraction and desire played important roles in the political alliances and social relationships that governed their world. The correspondence between noble lovers, with its elaborate literary forms and sophisticated cultural references, reveals educational systems and intellectual traditions that prepared aristocrats for complex forms of emotional and aesthetic expression. The ability to compose and appreciate poetry, to understand musical and artistic references, and to engage in sophisticated philosophical discussions about the nature of love and desire were all considered essential skills for successful participation in noble society. The marriage negotiations that preceded noble unions involved not only the immediate families of the bride and groom, but often extended networks of allies, vassals, and political partners whose interests had to be considered and accommodated. These complex diplomatic processes could extend over years and might involve multiple changes of plan as political circumstances shifted and new opportunities or challenges emerged. The wedding ceremonies of the nobility served multiple functions beyond the celebration of individual unions. They provided opportunities for the display of wealth and power, the strengthening of political alliances, the demonstration of cultural sophistication, and the creation of public records that would have legal and political significance for generations. The private lives of noble couples unfolded within elaborate social frameworks that governed everything from daily routines to seasonal activities. The ritual of rising and dressing, the formal meals that structured the day, the evening entertainments that provided opportunities for social interaction, and the seasonal migrations between different residences all created patterns of life that were both luxurious and highly regulated. The phenomenon of courtly love that developed around noble courts represented a sophisticated attempt to create cultural space for romantic expression within the constraints of political marriage systems. The elaborate literary and artistic traditions that celebrated extramarital romantic attachments provided emotional outlets and cultural validation for feelings that might otherwise have had no acceptable means of expression. The Church's role in regulating and interpreting intimate behavior across all levels of medieval society reflects the complex relationship between institutional authority and private experience that has characterized Christian culture throughout its history. The medieval Church's attempts to control and direct human sexuality were not simply expressions of repression or hostility toward physical pleasure, but rather serious efforts to integrate intimate behavior with broader spiritual and social goals. The confessional tradition that developed during the medieval period created unprecedented opportunities for religious authorities to understand and influence the intimate lives of their parishioners. The detailed manuals and guides that priests used to conduct these confessions reveal both the Church's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and sexuality and its genuine concern for the spiritual welfare of individuals struggling with the eternal tensions between desire and duty. The questions that medieval confessional manuals instructed priests to ask reveal remarkable knowledge of human sexual behavior and relationship dynamics. These guides addressed everything from marital difficulties and extramarital attractions to questions of sexual technique and reproductive health, suggesting that medieval clergy were expected to serve as counselors and advisors on the most intimate aspects of their parishioners' lives. The penitential systems that governed medieval religious practice created elaborate frameworks for addressing sexual sins and relationship problems. These systems recognized different degrees of transgression, various circumstances that might mitigate or aggravate guilt, and appropriate forms of penance that could restore individuals to good standing within their communities. The stories that emerge from medieval confessional records, tales of secret romances, forbidden attractions, moral dilemmas, and passionate relationships that defied social conventions, read like the plots of great literature because they reflect the same fundamental human experiences that have always provided the raw material for artistic expression. These narratives remind us that the great themes of love, loss, betrayal, and redemption that characterize the world's literature are not literary inventions, but rather the common experiences of human beings in every historical period. The development of increasingly sophisticated approaches to moral theology during the medieval period reflected the Church's growing understanding of the complexity of human motivation and the difficulty of applying universal principles to individual circumstances. The scholastic theologians who developed these systems were often remarkably subtle in their analysis of human behavior and surprisingly compassionate in their approach to human weakness and moral failure. The integration of classical philosophy, particularly Aristotelian ethics, into medieval Christian thought created frameworks for understanding human sexuality that were more nuanced and sophisticated than simple condemnation or approval. These philosophical approaches recognized the natural basis of sexual desire while insisting on the importance of rational control and moral discipline in governing intimate behavior. As we consider the full scope of medieval intimate life that we have explored together, what emerges most clearly is the remarkable continuity of human emotional experience across the centuries. The specific circumstances that shaped medieval relationships, the lack of privacy, the importance of family alliances, the constraints of religious doctrine, the realities of economic survival, were products of their particular time and place, but the emotions and desires that drove medieval people to seek love, form partnerships, and create families are the same emotions and desires that continue to motivate human behavior today. The medieval understanding of the relationship between love and marriage, which emphasized practical considerations and family obligations over individual romantic preference, may seem foreign to modern sensibilities, but it was based on a realistic assessment of the challenges facing people whose survival depended on successful economic and social cooperation. The elaborate rituals of courtly love that developed alongside these practical marriage arrangements provided outlets for romantic expression and emotional fulfillment that complemented rather than competed with the institution of marriage. This dual system, practical marriages supported by romantic traditions that acknowledged the importance of emotional and spiritual connection, may have been more successful than is often assumed in providing for both individual fulfillment and social stability. The high rates of marital satisfaction and low rates of divorce that characterized medieval society, despite the lack of individual choice in marriage partners, suggest that these arrangements may have had advantages that modern individualistic approaches to marriage sometimes lack. The medieval integration of physical and spiritual aspects of human experience, reflected in everything from the erotic imagery found in church buildings to the association between pilgrimage and sexual healing, suggests a more holistic approach to human nature than is often found in modern secular or religious thought. Medieval people understood that human beings were complex creatures whose spiritual development could not be separated from their physical and emotional needs. This integrated approach to human nature may explain why medieval people were able to create cultural and social institutions that acknowledged the full range of human experience without necessarily condemning or repressing aspects of human nature that did not conform to ideal standards. The tolerance for erotic imagery in sacred spaces, the acceptance of sexual themes in religious literature, and the integration of fertility concerns into spiritual practices all reflect an understanding of human nature that was both realistic and compassionate. The gradual changes in medieval attitudes toward love, marriage, and sexuality that occurred over the course of the medieval period, the increasing emphasis on individual choice, the development of more sophisticated approaches to romantic expression, the growing recognition of women's emotional and intellectual capabilities, represent early steps in the long historical process that would eventually lead to modern understanding of intimate relationships. Yet these changes were not simply progressive developments toward modern enlightenment, but rather adaptations to changing social and economic circumstances that created new opportunities and challenges for intimate expression. The growth of urban centers, the development of commercial economies, the increasing literacy of the population, and the gradual emergence of more complex political institutions all contributed to changing patterns of intimate life in ways that were neither predictable nor inevitable. The urbanization that began in the later medieval period created new forms of social organization that had profound implications for intimate relationships. The growth of cities brought together people from different backgrounds and social classes, creating opportunities for relationships that would have been impossible in the more stratified rural communities that had previously dominated European social organization. The development of commercial economies created new forms of wealth and new social classes that did not fit easily into traditional feudal hierarchies. Successful merchants and skilled craftsmen could accumulate resources that allowed them to live in ways that resembled nobility while maintaining social positions that were fundamentally different from traditional aristocracy. The increasing literacy of the population, particularly among urban dwellers, created new opportunities for romantic communication and cultural expression. The ability to read and write allowed people to participate in literary traditions that had previously been confined to clerical and noble circles, while also enabling more sophisticated forms of personal correspondence and intimate communication. The preservation of medieval texts, artifacts, and architectural remains that allow us to reconstruct these intimate aspects of medieval life is itself a testament to the importance that medieval people placed on love, beauty, and emotional expression. The care with which they created and preserved letters, poems, artworks, and other materials related to intimate relationships suggests that they understood these aspects of human experience to be significant and worthy of commemoration. The modern study of medieval intimate life, drawing on archaeological evidence, textual analysis, and comparative cultural studies, continues to reveal new aspects of this complex and fascinating culture. Each discovery adds to our understanding not only of medieval people themselves, but also of the broader patterns of human behavior and social organization that connect us across historical periods. The development of new archaeological techniques, including chemical analysis of residues, DNA analysis of human remains, and sophisticated dating methods, continues to provide new insights into medieval intimate life that were impossible for earlier generations of scholars to obtain. These technical advances allow modern researchers to answer questions about medieval diet, health, reproductive patterns, and lifestyle that were previously matters of speculation rather than scientific investigation. The application of anthropological and sociological methods to the study of medieval culture has revealed patterns of behavior and social organization that were invisible to traditional historical approaches focused primarily on political and religious institutions. The study of kinship systems, marriage patterns, household organization, and community structures has provided new perspectives on how medieval people actually lived and related to one another. The comparative study of medieval European culture with other historical societies has revealed both the unique characteristics of medieval intimate life and the broader patterns of human behavior that transcend particular cultural and historical circumstances. These comparative approaches help us understand which aspects of medieval experience were products of specific historical conditions and which reflect more universal aspects of human nature. The ethical questions raised by our study of medieval intimate life, issues of consent, power, exploitation, and individual autonomy, remain relevant to contemporary discussions about intimate relationships and social justice. The medieval experience, with its particular combination of constraints and opportunities, provides valuable perspectives on the eternal challenges of balancing individual desires with social responsibilities and protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation by those with greater power. The tension between individual autonomy and social obligation that characterized medieval approaches to intimate relationships continues to influence contemporary debates about marriage, family structure, reproductive rights, and sexual morality. The medieval understanding that intimate relationships have social and political dimensions that extend beyond the immediate interests of the individuals involved offers important perspectives on these ongoing discussions. The medieval recognition that intimate relationships require social support and community investment to succeed challenges modern assumptions about the purely private nature of romantic and sexual behavior. The elaborate social institutions that medieval communities developed to support marriage and family formation may offer valuable insights for contemporary societies struggling with high rates of relationship failure and family breakdown. The aesthetic traditions that medieval people developed around intimate relationships, the poetry, music, visual art, and architectural elements that celebrated love and desire, continue to influence artistic expression and cultural understanding of romantic relationships. The ideals of courtly love, the imagery of medieval romance, and the cultural innovations of figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine have left lasting marks on Western culture that persist in various forms today. The literary traditions that emerged from medieval courts continue to influence contemporary understanding of romantic relationships through their emphasis on the spiritual and emotional dimensions of love, their celebration of feminine beauty and wisdom, and their recognition of the transformative power of romantic attraction. The courtly romance tradition established patterns of romantic narrative that continue to appear in modern literature, film, and popular culture. The musical traditions associated with medieval courtly culture established connections between romantic expression and artistic achievement that continue to characterize Western approaches to love songs and romantic music. The troubadour tradition of celebrating love through sophisticated musical and poetic composition created models for romantic expression that continue to influence popular music and artistic culture. The architectural traditions that created intimate spaces within medieval buildings, private chambers, enclosed gardens, decorative alcoves, and hidden passages, established design principles that continue to influence contemporary approaches to domestic architecture and interior design. The medieval understanding of how physical spaces can support or constrain intimate relationships remains relevant to modern discussions of home design and urban planning. As we reach the end of our journey through the intimate landscape of medieval life, we are left with a deeper appreciation for both the differences and similarities between medieval and modern approaches to love, desire, and intimate expression. The specific forms that these fundamental human experiences took in the medieval world were shaped by circumstances that were unique to their time and place, but the underlying emotions and needs that drove medieval people to seek love, form partnerships, and create families are the same emotions and needs that continue to motivate human behavior across cultures and historical periods. The comfort that comes from recognizing these continuities, from understanding that we share fundamental emotional experiences with people who lived centuries ago in circumstances radically different from our own, can provide perspective on our own intimate struggles and relationships. The medieval experience reminds us that human beings have always found ways to love and be loved, to create meaningful connections with others, and to find satisfaction and fulfillment in intimate relationships despite whatever external constraints and challenges they may face. The resilience and creativity that medieval people demonstrated in their approaches to intimate life offer inspiration for contemporary individuals and communities facing their own challenges in creating and maintaining meaningful relationships. The medieval understanding that intimate relationships require both individual commitment and social support provides valuable perspectives on the importance of community investment in marriage and family formation. The medieval recognition that intimate relationships have spiritual as well as physical and emotional dimensions offers important insights for contemporary discussions about the meaning and purpose of romantic love. The integration of sacred and secular aspects of intimate experience that characterized medieval culture may provide models for contemporary people seeking to understand the deeper significance of their romantic and sexual relationships. The evening has grown quiet now around the ancient stones where medieval hearts once beat with the same rhythms that move us today. The candles that once illuminated passionate correspondence between distant lovers have long since burned down to stubs. The troubadours who once sang of impossible love have returned to dust, and the secret chambers where clandestine meetings once took place have surrendered their mysteries to archaeological investigation. Yet something essential persists across all these changes: the fundamental human capacity for love, the enduring need for intimate connection, and the creative power that drives people to transcend social limitations and express their deepest emotions despite whatever obstacles they may encounter. These qualities are not unique to any particular historical period, but rather represent the most persistent and valuable aspects of human nature itself. The medieval world, with all its constraints and limitations, its hierarchies and inequalities, its superstitions and ignorances, was nonetheless a world where real people lived authentic emotional lives, created meaningful relationships, and found ways to express their deepest feelings and desires. Their stories remind us that the essential experiences of human intimacy transcend the particular circumstances of any historical period and connect us across the centuries with those who faced the same fundamental challenges of loving and being loved that continue to define human existence. The whispered conversations that once echoed through castle corridors, the love letters that crossed dangerous territories to reach their intended recipients, the sacred vows that bound medieval couples together, and the quiet moments of tenderness that occurred in the humblest cottages. All of these intimate experiences speak to the eternal human quest for connection, understanding, and love that continues to motivate and inspire us today. As you settle into the comfort of your modern bed, surrounded by the conveniences and securities that medieval people could hardly imagine, let their stories remind you of the remarkable continuity of human emotional experience and the enduring power of love to transcend all the barriers that time, circumstance, and social convention can erect. In the quiet darkness, their whispered endearments and gentle touches echo still, connecting us across the centuries to the eternal human quest for intimacy, understanding, and love. The medieval understanding that love is both a personal experience and a social force, both an individual choice and a community responsibility, both a physical pleasure and a spiritual calling, offers wisdom that transcends historical boundaries and speaks to the eternal human condition. Their stories remind us that while the forms of love may change with circumstances, its essential nature remains constant, and its power to transform individuals and communities persists across all the changes and chances of human history. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are part of this great continuity of human experience, that the love in your own life connects you to countless generations who have felt the same emotions, faced the same challenges, and found the same deep satisfaction in the simple miracle of human connection that has sustained our species through all the changes and chances of recorded history. In your dreams, may you walk the ancient paths where medieval lovers once pledged their devotion, and may their courage in pursuing love despite all obstacles inspire your own journey toward intimate connection and emotional fulfillment.